Chapter 1 opened with a light-haired man getting punched in the stomach. Almost immediately afterward, he vomited while the man who punched him laughed. Another man laughed along and remarked on how harsh the blow had been. As they watched the light-haired man continue vomiting, the man who had punched him commented on how disgusting he looked before mockingly suggesting that the dying peasant could go die somewhere else. The other man muttered that the light-haired man was an idiot. The light-haired man coughed and slowly lifted his head. As saliva and vomit dripped from his mouth, he thought with disappointment that everything he had eaten had come back up. Wiping his mouth, he glared at the two men. He had no house, no money, and no other important possessions. He had nothing. Now he had even been used as a distraction by thugs in an alley that reeked of vomit and piss, while the food in jail had been terrible. He let out an inward sigh as the thought crossed his mind that his life had truly reached a dead end. Spitting onto the ground, he quickly stood and charged forward, thinking that perhaps this was what his life had become, at least until he came across that person. A little while later, the light-haired man staggered out of the alley. Cursing the two men, he complained that those punks had kept punching him in the stomach until everything he had eaten was gone. He frowned as he recalled the Yakuza he had once belonged to and his big brothers. He had gone to jail because they had promised to promote him if he fulfilled his duty. Rummaging through his pocket, he found only a handful of meager coins and realized that was all the money he had left. There was truly nothing he could do. As he glanced to the side and wondered what to do next, several coins slipped from his hand and rolled across the ground. He immediately chased after them, knowing they were all the money he had left. One coin eventually rolled to a stop, and he paused when he noticed red petals drifting everywhere. Confused, he saw a person lying on the ground atop a bed of those red petals. After a few moments, he looked more closely at the figure. Picking up one of the red petals, he realized they were flower petals. At first glance, he had mistaken them for blood. Feeling annoyed, he wondered whether the person was dead. Even so, he decided it did not really matter as long as they were not loitering there. As he continued grumbling and rolled the unconscious person over, his eyes widened the moment he saw their face. He instinctively leaned back in shock. Feeling his face grow hot, he realized the person was a woman. Looking at her unconscious form, he found himself wondering how such a beautiful human could even exist. More importantly, he questioned why she was lying unconscious in a place like this. He remained staring at her, wondering what kind of fairy tale he had stumbled into with someone lying atop roses. Suddenly, one of her eyes twitched and she slowly stirred awake. Sitting upright, she groggily wondered if she had fallen asleep. A moment later, her eyes widened as they focused on the light-haired man, and she questioned whether he had been the one who woke her. The light-haired man immediately waved his hand in denial, insisting that he had not done anything. A few minutes later, after they had cleaned up the flower petals, the long-haired person remarked that the light-haired man must have been shocked to find someone lying in a place like that and felt ashamed that he had seen them in such a state. The light-haired man stared at the long-haired person and wondered why they had been lying there in the first place. In response, the long-haired person smiled and explained what had happened. After hearing the explanation, the light-haired man summarized the situation in his mind. Her car had broken down, and because the store was nearby, she had decided to carry the goods herself. However, she had overexerted herself and collapsed, causing the flowers she was selling to become her cushion. The long-haired person reacted dramatically and, while holding one of the petals, reflected that they had never expected to fall on top of the flowers. They had been supposed to protect them and felt sorry for damaging them. Meanwhile, the light-haired man felt his face grow even warmer as he noticed that the long-haired person's sorrowful expression was strangely attractive. Looking more closely, he found himself drawn to her watery eyes beneath her long lashes. Even without makeup, she was beautiful. He wondered why that was, but his attention gradually drifted to her plump lips. Before his thoughts could wander any further, the long-haired person noticed his stare. The light-haired man immediately looked away and denied that anything was wrong. As the long-haired person stood, they explained that they would return to the car. However, they suddenly became dizzy and lost their balance. The light-haired man quickly caught them and cautioned them to be careful. The long-haired person weakly apologized and added that some of the flowers were still in the car. Noticing the sweat dripping from them, the light-haired man realized that she seemed to be in even worse condition. As a result, he offered to carry her on his back to the store so she could rest, while he would bring the flowers himself. The long-haired person reluctantly accepted the offer. As the light-haired man carried the long-haired person on his back, they apologized once again, pointed out that they did not even know each other, and wondered whether they were too heavy. The light-haired man assured them that they were not heavy at all. As he continued walking, he noticed that she was light, fair-skinned, and had a pleasant scent. At the same time, he absent-mindedly noted that her chest was small and that something was pressing against his hip. After a few minutes, they arrived at a house bearing the name Shiruzu. The long-haired person informed him that they had arrived. The light-haired man entered the property and realized that the long-haired person's house and the store were the same place. He helped the long-haired person sit down before removing his polo shirt and folding it into a makeshift pillow. Apologizing inwardly that it was only his shirt, he offered it so they would have something more comfortable to rest their head on. The long-haired person thanked him and commented on how kind he was. The light-haired man quietly told them not to worry about it. Shortly afterward, as he stepped outside, he found himself wondering when the last time someone had thanked him for anything had been. A few minutes later, while standing outside, the light-haired man noticed a particular truck and guessed that it belonged to the long-haired person. Looking inside, he reacted with awe at what he saw. A little while later, inside the Shiruzu household, the long-haired person sighed as they sat up. They reflected that they had calmed down considerably, though being alone really was difficult. Their gaze eventually fell upon the light-haired man's shirt. They remarked on how flashy it was and found themselves wondering whether the light-haired man was all right. Almost as if responding to that thought, the door opened, and the light-haired man entered, having finished what he had been doing. Later, they walked outside together, and you thanked the light-haired man once again while asking whether carrying everything had been difficult. The light-haired man replied that the problem had not been the weight itself. Instead, he had been overwhelmed by how expensive all the flowers looked. They stopped in front of the store and you laughed in agreement. Before they could continue, however, you turned toward the sound of someone calling his name and greeted a woman carrying an umbrella named Yuriko. You politely excused himself and explained that he was about to open the store. Yuriko replied that it was fine since it was still before opening time. You remarked that he had thought it was already time. Yuriko then asked whether you would mind picking out a nice face, adding that she would send one of the younger employees to pick it up later. You commented that it sounded nice and that it would be refreshing given how hot the weather was. After writing down the details, he assured Yuriko that it would be ready at the usual time. Yuriko then reached toward you and mentioned that she had gotten some nice tea leaves, suggesting they have tea together again. You happily agreed before politely bowing as Yuriko departed. After a few moments, you turned back to the light-haired man and explained that the customer had been the club owner, Yuriko. As you tied back his hair, he added that the flowers from this store were supplied to establishments like hers. The light-haired man remarked that there were many bars in the area since it was an entertainment district. At the same time, you pulled open the metal shutters and explained that the flower shop operated at night. Later that evening, you worked on his laptop for a while before finally closing it, having finished. As he approached the light-haired man, he apologized for making him help with closing up. The light-haired man told you not to worry about it and wondered whether the shop was already closing. You confirmed that he had closed the cash register and that the day's work was finished. As the light-haired man reached for another flower pot, you quickly stopped him, insisting that it was all right and that he could move it himself later. Nevertheless, the light-haired man insisted that it was fine because it was heavy, adding that if there was anything else heavy, he would carry that as well. You slowly thanked him once more. The light-haired man looked away and told him not to worry about it. Changing the subject, he asked whether you always worked this late by himself. You considered the question for a moment before admitting that there had been other staff before, but they had all quit. The light-haired man noted that he had thought you was working alone, which was a great deal of work, making it no surprise that he had collapsed. You fell silent for a moment, seemingly lost in thought. Noticing the pause, the light-haired man wondered what was wrong. After a brief hesitation, you asked whether he would be interested in working at the flower shop with him. The light-haired man reacted with visible confusion. Remaining completely serious, you explained that he had been a tremendous help that day. There were limits to what he could accomplish alone, and finding the right people at the right time was difficult. He added that the offer only applied if the light-haired man was currently looking for a job or something similar. Under Yu's direct gaze, the light-haired man felt his face grow warm and found himself wishing you would stop looking him straight in the eye. You then clenched his fists and added that they could also discuss his salary. The light-haired man looked away and admitted that it was true he had nothing to do at the moment. However, he also confessed that he did not have a place to live. Before he could continue, you immediately brightened and declared that it was not a problem. There was an available room, so Mitsuya could stay there. The light-haired man stared at him in disbelief and wondered whether he was serious. More importantly, he questioned whether you was really all right with letting someone like him stay there. You reacted with confusion but assured him that it was completely fine. The light-haired man slowly warned you not to regret it. At that point, you suggested that they introduce themselves. The light-haired man introduced himself as Mitsuya Keiru, 21 years old. In turn, you introduced himself as Shiruzu Uekairu and revealed that he was 29 years old. He then expressed his pleasure at meeting Mitsuya. The moment Mitsuya heard Yu's full name, his eyes widened. He immediately questioned whether Yu was not actually a woman. You calmly informed him that he was a man. For a moment, Mitsuya simply stared at him. Then, as realization struck, his face turned bright red, and he demanded to know why you had not said so sooner. You quickly explained that he had known it was a misunderstanding but had been wondering when Mitsuya would figure it out. In fact, it had been a long time since he had seen someone so oblivious. Mitsuya loudly protested and accused you of messing with him. However, just as he was about to continue arguing, he suddenly stopped himself. You looked puzzled as he waited to hear why Mitsuya had mistaken him for a woman. Instead, Mitsuya turned away and awkwardly insisted that it was nothing. You simply smiled and said that he looked forward to being in Mitsuya's care from then on. Mitsuya remained silent as he felt his face grow even hotter. Later, while soaking in the bath, Mitsuya let out a long sigh. Outside the room, you informed him that he would leave a towel for him. Mitsuya inwardly wondered whether you was serious. He could not believe how insensitive you could be. After all, you was flat-chested. There was no way he would have a woman's chest. Even so, when Mitsuya recalled Yu's face from earlier, he found himself thinking that you was cute. The realization immediately shocked him, and he jerked upright, wondering why he had just described you that way. Quickly trying to rationalize the thought, Mitsuya reminded himself that you was a man. Perhaps he had been in jail for so long that he could no longer distinguish women properly. No, it was not his fault. Mitsuya decided that the real problem was that Yu's face looked like a woman's. As he slowly sank back into the bathwater, he admitted to himself that he did not understand any of it. Still, it had been unbearably hot during the day and he had been beaten up by a group of punks. Surely that had to be the reason. Later, after finishing his bath, you led Mitsuya to the room he would be using and explained that it could be locked from the inside. As Mitsuya listened, he quietly convinced himself that his face was only hot because he had just taken a bath. Love at first sight was nothing more than an illusion. The following day, Mitsuya frowned as he read through several papers. Before long, he groaned and tossed them into the air, thinking that they were a complete pain. When he had woken up earlier, you had already left, and some kind of assignment had been left for him. Mitsuya complained inwardly that there was no way he could remember everything at once. After once again grumbling about what a hassle it all was, he considered heading to a convenience store. As Mitsuya walked toward the door, he wondered where you had gone and whether leaving him alone like this had really been a good idea. Opening the door, he sighed, thinking how dull everything felt. The next moment, he collided with a tall figure. Looking up, Mitsuya immediately wondered who the giant of a man was. As they stared at each other, he realized the stranger was a police officer. That realization only deepened his confusion, as he could not imagine why a police officer would be visiting the place. The tall man crouched down to get a better look at Mitsuya and asked whether he might be the new live-in part-timer. Mitsuya visibly jolted. The man then asked whether Yuichiru was home. After calling out several times without receiving a response, he concluded that you was not there. The police officer sighed, remarking that he had hoped to see you since he happened to be nearby. Adjusting his hat, he asked Mitsuya to tell Yuichiru that Ryu had stopped by and that he would see him later. As the officer walked away, Mitsuya stared after him in bewilderment. He could not make sense of the encounter. The police officer had a large build and an equally imposing presence. More importantly, he had addressed Yuichiru without using honorific. With that in mind, Mitsuya found himself wondering what kind of relationship the two of them had. That evening, you finally returned home. Mitsuya informed him that he had taken a bath first and that the water had been nice and warm. You smiled and told him to make himself comfortable. Just then, Mitsuya caught a familiar scent and immediately wondered whether it could be what he thought it was. His gaze drifted toward a plastic bag, and you noticed his reaction. Realizing what had caught Mitsuya's attention, you asked whether he liked KFC. Still visibly interested, Mitsuya replied that he was fine with it. You acknowledged the answer before leading the way to the kitchen. As they walked, you casually asked whether anything unusual had happened during the day. Mitsuya immediately replied that nothing had happened. Privately, however, he decided there was no need to mention the police officer. Satisfied, you remarked that it was good to hear. However, just as Mitsuya reached toward the refrigerator, you abruptly stopped him. Mitsuya reacted with confusion at the sudden interruption. Almost immediately, you apologized and insisted that he would open the refrigerator himself. Mitsuya explained that he had only wanted some barley tea. You quickly asked him to wait a moment before hurrying to the refrigerator. After opening it himself, he took out the barley tea and handed it to Mitsuya. Mitsuya accepted the drink, but Yu's unusual behavior did not escape his notice. As a result, he wondered whether Yu was all right, as he had seemed to be in a hurry. Yu immediately denied that anything was wrong and apologized for startling him. Then, eager to change the subject, he asked whether Mitsuya would mind bringing a plate to the table. Although uncertain, Mitsuya agreed and stepped away from the refrigerator. Only then did Yu quietly sigh in relief. As Mitsuya set the table, he found himself thinking that, as expected, Yu was still bad at hiding things. The more he thought about it, the more he felt guilty about keeping quiet about what had happened earlier. Eventually, he decided to speak up and mentioned that a police officer had come by. Before he could continue, however, the lights suddenly went out. Mitsuya immediately reacted to the darkness, assuming there had been a power outage. Concerned, he hurried toward the kitchen and called out to you, wondering whether he was all right. Then, a faint glow appeared in the darkness. Following the light, Mitsuya heard Yu's voice and saw the unusually serious expression on his face. You instructed him to sit down. Mitsuya gasped as the source of the glow became clear. Yu was holding a birthday cake lit by candles. Without fully understanding what was happening, Mitsuya returned to his seat at the dining table. As Yu approached, he began singing Happy Birthday. Mitsuya sat quietly, wondering why Yu was singing to him. A few moments later, Yu finished the song and encouraged him to blow out the candles. Still confused, Mitsuya complied. The moment the candles were extinguished, the lights came back on. At the same time, Yu popped confetti and happily congratulated Mitsuya on both his new job and his 22nd birthday. Yu explained that he had originally planned to congratulate Mitsuya on his new employment. However, after looking through Mitsuya's resume, he had discovered that it was also his birthday. Because of that, he had hurriedly prepared the surprise. Mitsuya remained silent as everything finally fell into place. The KFC Yu had brought home and the reason he had not allowed Mitsuya to open the refrigerator earlier had all been part of the surprise. Yu cheerfully announced that he would cut the cake. Before he could do so, however, he noticed Mitsuya's unusual silence and wondered whether something was wrong. He even asked if Mitsuya's stomach hurt. Yu then paused when he noticed Mitsuya sniffing and wiping at his eyes. Only then did he realize that Mitsuya was crying. Mitsuya reflected inwardly on the reason for his reaction. He had completely forgotten that it was his birthday. It had been a long time since anyone had celebrated it with him. Even so, he could hardly believe that something as simple as this had brought him to tears. After all, he had been in jail just the year before. Yu stepped closer and softly called Mitsuya's name. Then, without hesitation, he wrapped his arms around him. Mitsuya immediately froze in shock and demanded to know why he was suddenly being hugged. Quickly pulling away, he questioned whether Yu realized what he was doing. Yu simply smiled and explained that he had hugged Mitsuya because he was crying. Mitsuya turned away and muttered that you should not say such embarrassing things. Ignoring the complaint, Yu sat beside him and gently patted his head. Mitsuya's face instantly turned red. He loudly protested, reminding Yu that he had already told him to stop. Mitsuya further argued that he could not just sit there crying in front of another man. In response, Yu gently pointed out that when someone wanted to cry, they should cry with all their heart. Otherwise, they would forget how to cry. After saying that, Yu smiled and proudly added that if Mitsuya ever needed help, he could always come to him, provided Mitsuya did not mind relying on a 29-year-old uncle. Mitsuya insisted once again that there was no need. Yet despite his words, his thoughts betrayed him. He hated himself for being so simple. At that moment, Mitsuya realized that he liked Yu. Somewhere along the way, he had fallen in love with him. After sitting in silence for a while, Mitsuya awkwardly brought up the cake. Yu immediately brightened and agreed that they should cut it before the chicken got cold. Later that night, Yu exchanged messages with someone on his phone. The conversation eventually shifted to Yu asking when the other person would be returning to the main office. The person on the other end, Ryu, replied that it would probably be next year, as he was more suited to fieldwork. As Ryu opened a can of soda, Yu remarked that he had heard the fizzing sound and asked what he was drinking. Ryu answered that it was Diet Coke. A moment later, Ryu mentioned that he had stopped by Yu's place earlier that day, but Yu had not been home. Instead, there had been a mean-looking guy there. Yu paused briefly before laughing. He cheerfully explained that Ryu had already met the flower shop's new employee. Mitsuya was an honest and good kid, so he hoped Ryu would get along with him. Ryu replied that he did not mind at all. More importantly, he wanted to know how Yu's physical condition was. At the question, Yu subtly shifted his posture. He admitted that he had gone to the hospital again that day. Nevertheless, he reassured Ryu that he was doing fairly well and thanked him for his concern. Ryu did not respond immediately. Meanwhile, in his room, Mitsuya lay on his bed staring at the ceiling. He grew increasingly irritated as he remembered that he had forgotten to ask Yu about his relationship with the police officer, Ryu. Chapter 2 began with Mitsuya Keiru, a 27-year-old former Yakuza who had recently been released from prison and returned to the outside world, where he was now working at a flower shop. He was living with a man he had become interested in, Shiruzu Uekairu, a man who carried flowers as naturally as breathing. Today, as Mitsuya sprayed the plants, Yu called for his attention. A moment later, Yu held a bouquet close to Mitsuya and asked whether it looked nice. However, the only thing Mitsuya could think about was how close Yu was. Inwardly, he could hardly believe that after spending so many years surrounded by fighting and shouting, he had fallen in love at first sight. He questioned how he could have become so infatuated with Yu, yet his eyes could not help following him wherever he went. Although Yu's relationship with the police officer, Ryu, continued to bother him, simply living under the same roof as the person he liked was enough to keep his thoughts in turmoil. Before Mitsuya could finish thinking, Yu called for his attention again and proceeded to give him a long list of tasks. A staff member from the Shine Host Club would be coming, so the roses needed to be sorted. The ribbon on the shelf also needed to be replaced. The houseplants had to receive their nutrients, and the gypsophila by the door needed to be prepared as well. As Mitsuya hurriedly wrote down every instruction, he inwardly complained that it was far too much. Even so, he reminded himself that he was only an employee. As Mitsuya carried boxes around the shop, he reflected that there was always plenty of work to do. You responded with a shy smile and happily agreed, explaining that they had a steady number of regular customers, so the business would probably continue to do well. He further noted that there were many more high-end establishments farther inside the district, where both the number of customers and the amount each customer spent were much higher. While walking around the shop, Mitsuya recalled that the Yakuza office had once been decorated with tall flowers and grasses he had never recognized. A few moments later, he found the very same flower he used to see there. His eyes widened as he read that 5 stalks of moth orchids cost 50,000 yen. The price made his face pale. Shortly afterward, you remembered that Mitsuya had once mentioned being a Yakuza and wondered what his life had been like. Mitsuya snapped out of his thoughts, walked closer to you, and remarked that it was a rather sudden question. You acknowledged that but explained that he simply wanted to ask because there were not many customers at the moment. After thinking for a while, Mitsuya explained that he had mostly moved between his Aniki's house and his friends' houses. His job had been to watch over the group's businesses and drive people where they needed to go. At the time, he often complained that he was dissatisfied with his everyday life. One day, his Aniki had told him that if he truly did not want to stay that way, he would speak to the boss, and Mitsuya should get himself locked up. His Aniki had promised that if he fulfilled his duty, he would receive a high-ranking position in return. However, by the time Mitsuya had completed that duty, there was no place left for him. That was how he had ended up where he was now. You remarked once again that fate worked in strange ways. Even so, he believed they should be able to avoid dealing with the police again. Mitsuya observed that nothing really seemed to shake you. In response, you pointed out that Mitsuya was no longer part of the group. To you, the current Mitsuya was his precious employee, and the Yakuza had been foolish to let such a good kid go. At those words, warmth rose to Mitsuya's face. His selective hearing immediately took over, leaving him focused solely on the part where you had called him precious. Unfortunately, the moment was interrupted when a man in a suit entered the shop. Mitsuya reacted with annoyance, glaring at the newcomer as he inwardly complained that he had been enjoying the moment. You quickly nudged Mitsuya into a bow and apologetically explained that he was still new. The customer replied that it was fine and stated that he had come to pick up the flowers he had ordered. You informed him that they were ready and politely asked Mitsuya to bring out the orchid with the red ribbon from the back. As Mitsuya went to retrieve the orchid, he overheard you thanking the customer for his continued patronage and remarking that he had come a long way. The customer explained that it was no trouble because this shop was the easiest place for him to visit. While carrying the orchid over, Mitsuya inwardly groaned. He wondered whether the orchid had always cost 30,000 yen and why it had become so expensive. Upon arriving, he apologized for keeping them waiting. However, in the very next instant, his foot slipped, and the orchid flew into the air. Mitsuya cursed inwardly, convinced that the flowers were about to hit the ground. In a split second, the man in the suit caught both Mitsuya and the orchid in one smooth motion. As the customer remarked that it had been a close call, Mitsuya remained frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. Meanwhile, you hurriedly checked to make sure they were all right. The customer assured you that both he and the flowers were unharmed, while Mitsuya remained silent. After Mitsuya regained his footing, the customer calmly asked whether he could stand. Mitsuya responded only with a glare before slowly thanking him. Later that night, at 2 o'clock in the morning, as the flower shop reached closing time, Mitsuya groaned. Ever since his encounter with the man in the suit, he had been distracted and kept making mistakes. His thoughts were interrupted when you called to him and reminded him that it was closing time, asking him to take down the flowers and other items displayed outside. Mitsuya agreed, but inwardly thought that you must be crazy for not scolding him after all the mistakes he had made. Outside, while Mitsuya was putting away some of the plants, he heard someone call out to him from behind. A man wearing glasses asked whether he had a minute. Mitsuya stood, turned toward him, and asked what he wanted, explaining that they were in the middle of closing up. However, before he could finish speaking, another person suddenly smashed a flower pot over his head. As blood ran down his face, Mitsuya lost consciousness. Meanwhile, inside the flower shop, you remembered that Ryu had said he would stop by later. Because of that, he hoped Mitsuya and Ryu would get along. Looking at the time, you realized that Mitsuya was taking unusually long and noted that nearly 20 minutes had already passed. He headed outside and called out to Mitsuya, asking whether he was all right. You quickly noticed the broken flower pots scattered across the ground along with the blood. His expression immediately turned serious, and he hurried toward the back of the shop. Back with Mitsuya, who was badly beaten, the man with glasses asked if he was not taking things too far. He mocked Mitsuya for being a florist while still trying to fight them. Leaning closer with a grin, he said that he had thought Mitsuya was just another punk, but now he was a florist. Instead of answering, Mitsuya spat in the man's face. He struggled to his feet, groaning from the pain. Then he recognized the man with glasses as one of the people who had come to Yu's shop before. Mitsuya mocked them, saying they relied on surprise attacks, and if the lower-ranking members fought like cowards, then their leaders probably did too. He added that there was no point talking to a coward who could not even come through the front door. The man with glasses became furious. Before Mitsuya could rush forward, Yu suddenly appeared and called out his name. Mitsuya stopped and looked at him in surprise. Yu calmly walked into the alley and demanded to know what they were doing to his employee. The thugs only laughed at him, so Yu stepped closer and repeated the question in a cold voice. Mitsuya shouted for Yu to stay away, calling him an idiot for coming there. Yu simply raised a finger to his lips, signaling Mitsuya to wait. The thugs surrounded Yu. One of them claimed they had only been playing around. Another, thinking Yu was a woman, called him Missy, and warned that coming there alone would get him attacked. As the man with glasses reached toward Yu's face, Yu grabbed his arm and kicked him hard in the crotch. The man screamed in pain while Yu watched him fall without showing any mercy. Watching from the side, Mitsuya stared in shock, unable to believe Yu had really kicked the man there. As if answering his thoughts, Yu declared that thugs deserved no mercy. In the blink of an eye, he slammed one thug to the ground, kicked another down, and punched a third in the face. Mitsuya watched in amazement, realizing just how strong Yu really was. The man with glasses gritted his teeth, got back up, and suddenly grabbed Yu in a chokehold, shouting angrily at him. Mitsuya called out Yu's name as Yu struggled to break free. Suddenly, a flashlight shone into the alley. Ryu shouted, asking what was happening. One of the thugs cursed when he realized the police had arrived. They immediately let go of Yu and ran away. Ryu quickly checked if Yu was all right. He then turned to Mitsuya, referring to him as the staff member whose name he did not know, and asked if he was okay as well. After briefly wondering what had happened, Ryu decided it could wait. He told Yu that he would stop by later to talk, so you should go home and wait for him. Yu agreed as Ryu left. Over his radio, Ryu reported that the assault suspects had fled and that the police were pursuing them. A few moments later, Yu noticed that it had started raining. He told Mitsuya they should go home before he caught a cold, or else they would have to go to the hospital. When Yu saw how downcast Mitsuya looked, he helped him to his feet. As Mitsuya looked at him, Yu gently reminded him that he was a good kid and that they should go home. Later, after returning home, Yu sighed and remarked that they were completely soaked. He said he was sure there was a hospital nearby that was open at night, and suggested they go there after drying themselves off. Mitsuya remained silent. Yu stood in front of him, smiled, and urged him to dry himself, joking that he would do it for him if he did not. Mitsuya suddenly grabbed Yu's hands. Trembling, he apologized for dragging Yu into the fight and for getting him hurt. Inwardly, Mitsuya did not care about his own injuries. He only felt guilty that the person he had fallen in love with, the one who had saved him, had been hurt because of him. He thought he was pathetic and quietly apologized again. Just as Yu was about to respond, he suddenly coughed. He realized something was wrong. As the coughing continued, Mitsuya insisted that someone as foolish as him would only be a burden. Before he could finish, however, he noticed that Yu could not stop coughing. Confused, he called out to him. Yu trembled as he gasped for breath and tried to speak, but instead he collapsed to the floor, coughing and struggling to breathe. Mitsuya shouted in alarm and asked what was wrong, but Yu continued coughing. Chapter 3 began inside Yu's mind, where he drifted in pain as though he were sinking to the bottom of the sea. He realized he had let his guard down. If Ryo had not arrived, the situation would have become dangerous. More than anything, he needed to get up and treat Mitsuya's wound. Letting out an inward sigh, he regretted not putting his inhaler in his pocket. The next moment, Yu abruptly snapped awake as Ryu and Mitsuya called his name at the same time. He weakly murmured their names before Ryu immediately raised the inhaler to his mouth. As Yu inhaled the medicine, Ryu slowly pressed the inhaler while Mitsuya silently waited for him to recover. After several minutes, Yu quietly thanked Ryu and wondered why he was there. Ryu explained that after bringing in the people who had attacked Yu, he came to check on him because he had promised to talk with him. Instead, he found Mitsuya with his head soaked and Yu collapsed on the floor. Mitsuya stiffened in shock and embarrassment when Ryu referred to him as a honeybee, but Ryu paid him no attention and asked Yu where the medicine was. Mitsuya silently gritted his teeth. Ryu examined Yu's neck and noted that he had been choked quite badly before checking if he was all right. Yu smiled, assured him that he was fine, and thanked him once more. Accepting the answer, Ryu headed to the kitchen, intending to borrow it for a while. As soon as he left, Yu reached toward Mitsuya and apologized for making him worry. Mitsuya remained silent while Yu gently patted his head, smiling to himself at how obediently Mitsuya accepted it. Mitsuya flinched in pain, causing you to apologize again and urge him to stop worrying about him and go to the hospital instead. Mitsuya looked confused, only then becoming aware of the pain in his head. A short while later, Ryu returned from the kitchen carrying a pitcher of water and repeated that Mitsuya needed to go to the hospital. When you tried to stand, Ryu stopped him and insisted that he rest as well. Handing him a glass of water, Ryu explained that he would take Mitsuya to the night hospital near the station and speak with him during the drive. Yu reluctantly agreed. He searched through his bag, took out an envelope, and handed it to Mitsuya. Mitsuya looked at it in confusion as Yu explained that it would serve as a substitute for an insurance card until the actual card was issued, and that presenting the document at the hospital would be enough. Mitsuya's expression darkened as he questioned whether Yu truly meant it after everything that had happened. With Mitsuya still silent, Yu stood and told Ryu that he would rest in his room and let him know once they returned. Noticing that Mitsuya's shirt was completely soaked, Ryu decided to find him a change of clothes. Yu agreed and asked him to wait a moment. A few minutes later, Ryu returned and signaled for Mitsuya to come with him, giving him only 30 seconds to get ready before they left. Later, as they drove away, Mitsuya found the silence inside the car uncomfortable. Ryu casually reminded him to fasten his seatbelt so they would not get into trouble. Mitsuya noticed that Ryu had changed clothes as well, and Ryu explained that he had also been drenched by the rain. He then stated that after Mitsuya's examination at the hospital, he intended to interrogate him, so Mitsuya should not fall asleep. Mitsuya quietly watched him for a moment before asking himself about the relationship between Ryu and Yu. Ryu showed mild surprise that Mitsuya had never heard the answer. Mitsuya admitted that he had not, while thinking about how he had been struggling to ask Yu about it. Ryu then explained that Yu was his older brother. Mitsuya was stunned, unable to believe they were related since they looked nothing alike. Immediately sensing what Mitsuya was thinking, Ryu confirmed it and explained that they were only half-brothers. Yu's mother had been frail and passed away at a young age. Afterward, their father remarried and Ryu was born. Ryu laughed and proudly remarked that he had inherited a great deal from their father, though not his personality. Ryu went on to explain that the Shiruzu family had served as police officers for generations. Yu had once dreamed of becoming one as well. He had been exceptionally talented, and everyone had high expectations for him. However, his body was never very strong. In the end, he pushed himself too hard trying to meet those expectations and eventually broke down. Before graduating, he withdrew from police school. One thing led to another, and he ended up working at the flower shop instead. Even so, Ryu admitted that he still worried about Yu, which was why he worked at the precinct near the shop so he could stop by and check on him from time to time. After hearing the whole story, Mitsuya quietly realized that it explained why Ryu had shown up. He then wondered whether it was really all right for him to know such personal details. Ryu thought it was never something they had intended to hide, and even if he had said nothing, he believed Yu would have eventually told Mitsuya himself. As Ryu parked near the hospital, he remarked that Yu could be a bit absent-minded, but he trusted his judgment of people. Before this, Yu had spoken about Mitsuya with more excitement than ever before, saying that someone interesting had appeared. After parking, Ryu suddenly stared at Mitsuya. The unexpected look made Mitsuya flinch. Ryu grinned, convinced that Mitsuya was a good person. Flustered, Mitsuya dismissed him as nothing more than a brokon. Ryu laughed and openly admitted that he was an extreme brokon because Yu was an older brother he deeply respected and looked up to. Mitsuya looked away, thinking that there was no competing with Ryu when it came to being Yu's brother. Even so, Yu was the only person in the world who would have reached out to someone as hopeless as him. Remembering Yu's gratitude, Mitsuya quietly decided that he wanted to take care of Yu in his own way. After they got out of the car, Ryu noticed that the rain had stopped and checked whether Mitsuya had brought any money. Mitsuya looked into his pocket and showed him what he had. Seeing the amount, Ryu reacted in disbelief, remarking that even elementary school students carried more money than that. Mitsuya explained that it could not be helped since he had only recently started working. Ryu wondered what Mitsuya had been doing before then. Mitsuya lowered his head, searching for an answer while realizing that Yu had not told Ryu about his past. Noticing his hesitation, Ryu sighed and decided not to press the matter any further. Since it could not be helped, he would cover the expenses this time. Mitsuya was shocked that Ryu was willing to do that. Ryu added that Mitsuya could repay the debt by working under Yu, joking that he would charge high interest. Mitsuya immediately panicked, only for Ryu to reveal that he had been joking. Mitsuya remarked that Ryu was a rather strange police officer. Smirking, Ryu admitted that he heard that often. As they walked toward the hospital, Ryu commented that Yu seemed to like Mitsuya, so if anything happened to Mitsuya, Yu would end up pushing himself too hard again. Even so, he added that he still had no intention of lending Mitsuya any money. Mitsuya said nothing, though the remark irritated him. After a short while, Ryu asked for Mitsuya's full name. Mitsuya introduced himself as Mitsuya Keiru. Ryu reacted with surprise, bluntly remarking that the name did not suit him despite being unexpectedly beautiful. Mitsuya silently thought that if Ryu had not been Yu's brother, he would have beaten him up. He then confirmed Ryu's name, and Ryu affirmed it, explaining that it was Ryu from the word cool, and suggesting that Mitsuya call him Mr. Right. Mitsuya immediately refused. Meanwhile, back at Yu's home, a looming figure appeared beside Yu's bedside as he rested. A short while later, Ryu returned home, exhausted after everything that had happened. He remarked that Mitsuya had bled so much that the injury on his head looked like a 10-yen bald spot, even wondering if Mitsuya's body was overly dramatic. Mitsuya sharply dismissed the comment, thinking that Ryu talked far too much despite knowing nothing. As they entered the house, Mitsuya suddenly noticed a pair of unfamiliar shoes at the entrance. Alarm shot through him as he suspected they belonged to one of the men from earlier. Without hesitation, he rushed upstairs while calling out for Yu. Ryu immediately recognized the shoes and thought they probably belonged to Yukamasa, but before he could finish the thought, Mitsuya had already burst noisily into Yu's room. The next instant, Mitsuya was seized and slammed onto the floor. Confused, he looked up, wondering who was sitting on top of him. Chapter 4 continued immediately after Mitsuya was pinned to the floor. As he lay there, he could only wonder how he had ended up in that situation. Looking back, he had rushed upstairs to Yu's room after seeing the unfamiliar shoes, only for a man in a suit he had never met to attack him. Even now, the man was pressing his full weight down on him. Yu quickly tried to pull the attacker away, calling him Yukamasa and telling him that the person beneath him was Mitsuya. Yukamasa questioned who Mitsuya was, prompting Yu to explain that Mitsuya was the live-in staff member at his flower shop. After a brief pause, Yukamasa politely excused himself as he got off Mitsuya. Mitsuya replied that it was not a problem. As Mitsuya sat up, he found himself wondering who Yukamasa was. At first, he thought Yukamasa might simply be one of Yu's friends, though there was something about his appearance that reminded him of Yu. Then the name Yukamasa caught his attention, and he slowly began putting the pieces together. Since Ryu looked nothing like Yu, Mitsuya had never considered it before, but Yukamasa might actually be Yu's younger sibling. Then again, Yukamasa was taller than Yu, making Mitsuya wonder if he was the older brother instead. After Yu and Yukamasa spoke for a short while, Yukamasa suddenly turned his gaze toward the doorway and called out to Ryu, asking how long he intended to keep hiding before telling him to come out. Mitsuya realized he had almost forgotten about Ryu. Ryu peeked around the corner with a sly smile, greeting Inspector Shiruzu Yukamasa and wondering what had brought him there. Yukamasa explained that he had been on his way home from dinner and had planned to take a nap when he noticed Ryu's police uniform hanging out to dry. Ryu immediately understood. With the explanation out of the way, Yukamasa decided that, since he was already there, he might as well check the contents of Yu's refrigerator. He had just noticed that Yu had lost weight again and that his lips had turned blue. Yu feigned surprise. Yukamasa fixed him with an even harder stare before asking whether he had eaten what had been sent to him. Yu's face turned pale as he swallowed nervously and hurriedly insisted that it was all a misunderstanding. He claimed he simply had not found the time yet. Yukamasa watched him for several more seconds before silently heading downstairs. Yu, Ryu, and Mitsuya watched him leave. Soon afterward, the sound of chopping followed by sizzling drifted upstairs. After several minutes, Mitsuya commented to himself that whatever was cooking smelled delicious. A moment later, he noticed Yu trembling beside him and wondered what was wrong. The bedroom door suddenly opened and Yukamasa returned. The instant he appeared, Yu let out a shriek. Yukamasa placed a plate on the table and instructed Yu to eat it immediately. Mitsuya looked at the dish, wondering why Yukamasa had prepared stir-fried liver with garlic chives, while noting how appetizing it looked. In contrast, Yu could only stare at it as his face turned pale. Ryu attempted to reason with Yukamasa, but Yukamasa explained that the liver had been the very one sent to Yu to help with his anemia, yet there had not even been any sign that the package had been opened. Seeing Yu's gloomy expression, Mitsuya realized that Yu must be unable to eat liver. Yu admitted that he simply could not tolerate its sticky texture and taste, no matter what. Yukamasa declared that if Yu refused to eat it, it would be blended into a drink and forced down instead, reminding him not to take food for granted. Yu protested that doing so would leave him unable to eat anything afterward and pleaded not to use the blender. With no other choice, Yu picked up his chopsticks and slowly brought the food to his mouth. Mitsuya was impressed, believing that Yu had managed to eat the liver after all. However, Yukamasa immediately pointed out that Yu was only eating the garlic chive. Mitsuya quietly realized that Yu had been caught. Yukamasa took the plate away from Yu and decided that if he could not eat it himself, then he would simply be fed. Yu let out a startled cry before quickly apologizing and explaining that liver was the one thing he truly could not eat, though he could eat anything else. Yukamasa questioned why Yu did not improve his condition through some other method instead. Yu slowly admitted that he had been so busy lately that he had neglected himself. Mitsuya remained silent beside them while Ryu sighed to himself, knowing exactly where the conversation was headed. Yukamasa suggested taking Yu to the hospital, pointing out that Yu had relied on temporary medication for far too long without making any real progress. Although his condition would sometimes improve for a while, it always returned to the way it had been before. From Yukimasa's perspective, Yu was constantly running away from facing himself. Ryu immediately scolded Yukimasa, thinking that there were better ways to say it. You happened to be in poor condition at the moment. Even so, he quietly admitted that Yukimasa was right. He apologized, acknowledging that it was pathetic to argue over food at his age, and resolved to do his best to eat it. Mitsuya frowned, unable to understand what was happening. Before anyone could stop him, he took the plate from Yu and began eating the liver himself. He did not know whether Yukimasa was truly Yu's sibling or not, but Yu had already made it clear that he could not eat liver. Mitsuya believed they should not force their own views on him simply because he could not eat stir-fried liver and garlic chive. He also thought it was unreasonable to make Yu eat such a heavy meal in the middle of the night. On the other hand, Mitsuya had just been injured and had lost a great deal of blood, making the meal far more suitable for him. He also declared that if anything happened to Yu, he would take responsibility. After finishing the entire plate of stir-fried liver, Mitsuya set it down, grabbed Yukimasa by the chest, and declared that he would be the one to support Yu from now on. Because of that, Yu could collapse whenever he needed to, since Mitsuya would always be there for him. Yu's expression softened. Yukimasa calmly removed Mitsuya's hand and remarked that he was the most passionate employee she had ever seen. Satisfied with that, she decided to leave everything to them and head home to get some sleep. As Yukimasa stood, Ryu checked the time and decided that he should leave as well because he still had paperwork waiting for him. Before departing, Yukimasa called Mitsuya's attention. When he looked over, she smiled and informed him that the rest of the liver would be left to him. There were still 5 kilograms remaining. Mitsuya froze in complete disbelief at the amount. A few minutes later, Ryu called out to Mitsuya as well, entrusting Yu to his care before waving goodbye. Mitsuya and Yu quietly watched as Yukimasa and Ryu left. Once they were alone, Mitsuya questioned what Yukimasa's deal was. Yu explained that Yukimasa had always been the type to appear without warning. More than that, Mitsuya admitted that he had never known Ryu was Yu's younger brother. Since Ryu looked nothing like Yu while Yukimasa did, he had assumed Yukimasa was the older sibling. Yu looked surprised before explaining that Yukimasa's name often caused misunderstandings. In reality, Yukimasa was his younger twin sister. The revelation drained the color from Mitsuya's face. Yu continued by explaining that Yukimasa's masculine-sounding name and appearance often led people to make that mistake. Mitsuya averted his gaze as the realization struck him that he had grabbed a woman's chest, and not just any woman, but Yu's sister. Yu added that the liver had been something Yukimasa had prepared especially for him. She had always worked hard for his sake while carrying the expectations placed upon her, so he hoped Mitsuya would not blame her too harshly. Though awkward, she was a kind sister. Mitsuya remarked that all 3 siblings somehow had completely different personalities. Yu was easygoing, Yukimasa was strict, and Ryu was shrewd. Yu laughed and agreed. After a short silence, Yu asked how the hospital visit had gone. Mitsuya explained that by the time he arrived, the wound on his head had almost completely healed. Yu wondered how that could be possible after seeing so much blood. Mitsuya replied that he had always been physically tough and had also received his medicine. Because of that, he meant everything he had said earlier. He would even give his life for Yu if necessary. Whether it was eating liver on Yu's behalf or taking care of heavy work, he intended to handle it all. Yu sat up in bed and quietly thought that Mitsuya was a very kind person. Mitsuya immediately denied it. After a brief pause, Yu apologized, leaving Mitsuya confused about the reason. Yu wondered whether working as a florist was difficult. He had believed he would end up alone again once Mitsuya eventually left, so he had thought he had no choice but to accept that. Now, however, he could hardly believe that Mitsuya cared so deeply about him. Yu felt incredibly fortunate to have such a devoted employee. Mitsuya could not understand what Yu meant. Seeing Yu's confusion in return, Mitsuya explained that Yu had given him a place to stay when he had nowhere else to go. Yu was his benefactor, the person who had taken him in. Yu quietly murmured Mitsuya's name. Mitsuya added that, beyond everything else, he had been surprised by how strong Yu actually was. Yu laughed and assured him that he could leave self-defense to him, adding that he would teach Mitsuya someday if he wanted to learn. Mitsuya readily accepted the offer. As their conversation continued, Yu noticed the sound of birds chirping outside and slowly drew back the curtains. The sudden brightness made Mitsuya immediately cover his eyes. Yu looked surprised as he realized it was already morning. Seeing Yu's gentle smile, Mitsuya felt warmth spread across his face. Quietly, he admitted to himself that he liked Yu. Even if he confessed now, he was certain he would not receive an answer. Then, a sudden thought crossed his mind. Yu remarked on the cool morning air and slowly opened the window. Meanwhile, Mitsuya struggled with his thoughts. He wanted to say it. He truly wanted to say it. It was becoming unbearable. Gathering his resolve, Mitsuya stood and confessed his feelings to Yu. Unfortunately, at that exact moment, a group of cats began fighting outside, completely drawing Yu's attention away. Mitsuya immediately sat back down. Noticing the movement, Yu apologized and wondered what Mitsuya had just said. After a brief hesitation, Mitsuya simply looked away and decided it had been nothing. Chapter 5 began inside the office of the black-haired man in a suit. A knock sounded at the door and he asked what it was. The person outside addressed him as boss and informed him that his car was ready. The man in the suit acknowledged the report. Meanwhile, Mitsuya was sweeping outside the shop. After a few minutes, he let out a sigh and realized there was no point dwelling on it. He had just remembered that he had lost to a cat's screaming. You had not heard his confession that morning. Although the wounds from his fight had healed and he should have been able to relax, he remained completely absent-minded. That cat should not have been fighting so early in the morning. Mitsuya squatted down and weakly urged himself to simply say it, but the impulse that had driven him before had already faded. On top of that, he believed that saying anything would only become a burden to you. You would probably think of him as nothing more than a freeloader. After pausing for a moment, Mitsuya slapped himself and forced himself to stop hesitating. He reminded himself that he was a man. More importantly, he decided to focus on supporting you. With his thoughts settled for the moment, he returned to the shop and informed you that he had finished cleaning. You thanked him, but Mitsuya noticed that you was still writing and wondered what he had been working on all this time. As if on cue, you suddenly finished what he was doing and asked Mitsuya what he thought of it. Unsure what he meant, Mitsuya looked as you showed him the drawing, explaining that it was the first time he had tried drawing by himself. Mitsuya leaned closer and found it impressive, then wondered how you had drawn it. You bashfully laughed, thanked him, and explained that it was made with chalk and that the style was called chalk art. Mitsuya stared at it in confusion, thinking it was really made with chalk, and found himself wondering when he had last seen something like it. He reflected that you was not only beautiful, kind, and strong, but also capable of drawing so well. You truly seemed too talented. Mitsuya remarked that you was good at everything, and hearing that made you happy. After a brief pause, you explained that they had received a large stock of good roses, and was thinking they should hold a fair. Mitsuya questioned the idea, prompting you to explain that it would be a buy 10, get 1 free promotion. While 10 was a nice number, he explained that the number of roses in a bouquet also carried different meanings. 10 roses symbolized that everything about someone was perfect, while 11 roses meant that the recipient was beloved and deeply loved. Mitsuya took a deep breath as his heartbeat quickened, reminding himself that you was not saying those words to him and was only giving an explanation. Completely unaware of Mitsuya's inner turmoil, you continued explaining that other numbers also had their own meanings, so it would be useful to know them when making suggestions to customers. He added that remembering them would be beneficial and, fortunately, he had also prepared a cheat sheet. Mitsuya blushed as he accepted the cheat sheet. He moved to the side and began reading through it while you quietly watched him, his expression gradually becoming serious. A little while later, Mitsuya continued reading through the cheat sheet. He reacted with curiosity and questioned whether some of the meanings were really correct because, somehow, they made him feel a little embarrassed. His gaze drifted toward the pot of roses, and he noted that their meaning changed depending on the number given. As a result, he began wondering whether it would be strange if he gave some to you. Before he could think any further, Mitsuya called you over. You approached him and asked whether there was something he did not understand. Mitsuya replied that there was not, but after a moment of hesitation, shyly asked what use type was. You smiled and wondered whether this had turned into girl talk. Mitsuya looked away and denied it, explaining that he had only been thinking about the roses. You thought for a moment and reflected that the topic sometimes came up while having tea with Yuriko and the girls, though it was usually nothing more than casual conversation. Before you could answer the question, the man in the suit from earlier entered the flower shop. You immediately welcomed him. Disappointment crossed Mitsuya's face because you had never answered his question. The man thanked you for everything, as always, and explained the reason for his visit. Meanwhile, Mitsuya recognized the bespectacled man in the suit as the same customer who had come before. He initially assumed the man was simply a regular, but the longer he watched, the more he realized it was something else. The man radiated unmistakable affection toward you, so obvious that even Mitsuya could tell. Mitsuya watched as the man asked you whether he recommended any flowers. Before you could respond, Mitsuya suddenly stepped between them and declared that he would take care of the customer instead. You agreed despite his confusion. Addressing the man politely, Mitsuya enthusiastically explained that, thanks to their current fare, he could get an incredible bargain. The man immediately decided to take the offer, and Mitsuya cheerfully accepted. Off to the side, you quietly reminded Mitsuya that this was not a produce stand. As Mitsuya prepared the bouquet, you instructed him to tape it first, then roll and secure it. After Mitsuya followed those instructions, you remarked that the ribbon was sufficient. Throughout the process, Mitsuya remained completely flustered by how close you was, but he continued working. Once the bouquet was finished, he proudly declared that he had done it. You praised his hard work before reminding him to hand it over. Mitsuya immediately acknowledged the reminder. He presented the bouquet to the man in the suit and informed him that the total was 2,500 yen. The man quickly took money from his wallet and thanked Mitsuya. To Mitsuya's confusion, the man did not head for the exit. Instead, he walked over to you. As you asked what he could do for him, the man asked you out on a date. The moment those words were spoken, Mitsuya's face turned pale. Later that day, somewhere in the bathhouse, Mitsuya sat together with Ryu. Ryu questioned why Mitsuya had suddenly called him out of the blue and wondered what he was supposed to make of it. Meanwhile, Mitsuya could only mutter to himself, wondering why, of all places, they had ended up meeting at the bathhouse. Chapter 6 continued in the bathhouse, where Ryu noticed that Mitsuya seemed to have something he wanted to ask. Since Ryu was on the night shift that day, he questioned him about it. Mitsuya only glared at him, prompting Ryu to frown and splash water onto his face to urge him to hurry up and say what was on his mind. Mitsuya protested, telling him to wait and stop. After turning away for a moment, he asked what someone should do if the person they had fallen for was confessed to right in front of them. Ryu paused briefly before asking whether Mitsuya had experienced that himself. Mitsuya immediately denied it in shock, insisting that it was only a hypothetical example. Ryu reminded him not to raise his voice because it echoed through the bath. As Mitsuya sank deeper into the water, Ryu answered that it depended on how that person reacted. If they were excited about the confession, then it would be frustrating because the other person already had the advantage. If they seemed troubled by the confession instead, then there was still a chance. Even so, Ryu admitted that if he were in that situation, he would give up either way. Mitsuya remained silent, and when Ryu also fell quiet, Mitsuya indicated that he was still listening. Ryu stood up and continued, saying that even then, it might be difficult to make you fall in love with him. Mitsuya admitted that he already knew that. A moment later, his eyes widened as he realized that Ryu had figured out he liked you. Ryu chuckled at how slow Mitsuya had been to notice. He pointed out that Mitsuya had been far too obvious, and that Yukimasa had already noticed as well, even commenting on how easy he was to read. Mitsuya was left stunned. Inwardly, he cursed himself and thought about how embarrassing it was. Still, after making such a big fuss over it, it was only natural that they had noticed. As they stepped out of the bath and headed toward the lockers, Ryu asked how you had been confessed to. Mitsuya explained that, strictly speaking, you had only been invited out to dinner, although he had seemed somewhat troubled by it. While they put on their underwear, Ryu asked when the dinner was. Mitsuya answered that, if he remembered correctly, it would be that Sunday when the shop was closed. Ryu patted Mitsuya on the shoulder and suggested that, since he also had the day off, they should spy on them together. Mitsuya was left completely bewildered. Later that Sunday, you finished putting on his shoes and indicated that he was leaving for dinner. Mitsuya acknowledged it, but just as you turned toward the door, he stopped him after noticing that his collar was crooked. Mitsuya quickly straightened it before deciding it looked much better. You thanked him, then noticed Mitsuya's expression and wondered if something was wrong. Mitsuya looked away, dismissed it as nothing, and wished him a safe trip. As soon as you left the house, Mitsuya immediately grabbed his phone and informed Ryu that you had just departed. A short while later, they sped through the streets on Ryu's motorcycle. Ryu scolded Mitsuya for not holding on properly. Mitsuya shot back that he already knew. He then questioned whether Ryu was really sure about going through with this. Ryu asked what he meant, and Mitsuya clarified that he was talking about tracking down his own brother. Ryu remarked that it was strange for him to bring that up only now and asked whether he was not curious. He added that if Mitsuya was scared, they could always turn back. Determination immediately filled Mitsuya's face as he refused to go back. Ryu laughed at his reaction. Mitsuya accused him of clearly enjoying himself, and Ryu casually admitted that he was. Meanwhile, outside a restaurant, the man in the suit checked the time. A moment later, someone called his name, causing Tsubaki to look over. He gasped the instant he saw you. You approached and apologized for keeping him waiting, but Tsubaki immediately assured him that it was not a problem. He admired how beautiful you looked that day, leaving you visibly embarrassed as he brushed the remark off as teasing. Tsubaki chuckled before leading you inside the restaurant. Watching from not far away, Mitsuya silently cursed, unwilling to accept Tsubaki becoming so friendly with you. Ryu remained silent for a moment before suddenly asking whether Mitsuya was a Yakuza. Mitsuya's eyes widened as his heart skipped a beat. Fortunately, Ryu quickly explained that the man with the glasses accompanying you was the young head of the Seisaku group. Mitsuya immediately understood. Ryu wondered whether it really was only a meal. Depending on how things unfolded, he might have to report him. Mitsuya silently noted that the man in the suit certainly did not give off the impression of an ordinary person. Now that he thought about it, the Seisaku group was the same organization his older brothers had raided. Looking through his phone, Ryu remarked that the restaurant appeared to have private rooms, so they had most likely been taken to one. It was highly rated and expensive. Mitsuya observed that keeping an eye on them would be difficult. Ryu then asked whether the bug had been planted. Mitsuya sighed, admitting that he had been so nervous that he never imagined he would end up bugging you. Even so, he reminded himself that there was no time to hesitate now. Meanwhile, inside the restaurant, you noticed that Tsubaki ran a bar. Tsubaki confirmed it and admitted that he was genuinely happy to be enjoying a relaxed dinner with you like this. You laughed and let him know that he was always happy to join him. Tsubaki then asked whether you would like to visit one of his favorite craft breweries. You remarked that craft beer was very popular lately and said he would like to go, since he usually only drank canned beer. Tsubaki enthusiastically suggested comparing different drinks together, and you agreed that it sounded fun. Outside, Ryu and Mitsuya moved into a nearby shop to avoid attracting suspicion. Mitsuya ground his teeth as he listened to the conversation between Tsubaki and you. He thought they were acting far too lovey-dovey, while Ryu pointed out that Tsubaki was already arranging the next date and was remarkably quick at moving things along. Both of them reacted at once when they heard Tsubaki ask you what kind of person he was attracted to. Ryu eagerly recognized that the conversation had finally reached romance, while Mitsuya angrily wished he would be quiet. Back inside the restaurant, you took a moment to think before explaining that, since he enjoyed drinking, he guessed he liked someone he could drink with. He also liked people who could have a good time together. Most importantly, he liked someone who appreciated him for who he was. Coincidentally, all three qualities described both Tsubaki and Mitsuya. Outside, Ryu watched Mitsuya begin trembling visibly and questioned what exactly he was shaking for. Meanwhile, Tsubaki remarked that you was a very likable person. You laughed it off, insisting that was not true. He pointed out that Tsubaki was also very handsome, so he doubted people stayed quiet about it. Tsubaki denied that as well. Because of his line of work, he found it difficult to trust people, so whenever someone approached him, he always questioned their motives. Perhaps that was why he had not had a girlfriend for a long time. Even so, whenever he became interested in someone, he usually made the first move. He admitted that he was always thinking about the person he liked and might even become the type to grow overly attached. Just then, a waiter arrived to ask whether they would like another serving. As you accepted the menu, he admitted that he was a little surprised. He had thought Tsubaki was a rational person, but he turned out to be quite the romantic at heart. Tsubaki looked surprised, prompting you to quickly apologize in case he disliked being described that way. Tsubaki laughed and admitted that if one of his subordinates had said it, he would have felt embarrassed and obliged to respond. Hearing it from you instead made him genuinely happy. You paused briefly before expressing that he felt honored, earning another amused chuckle from Tsubaki. As they continued eating, you remarked that the food was really delicious. Tsubaki suggested that if you liked it, he could take some home as a souvenir. He then asked what you would like for dessert. Meanwhile, outside, Ryu and Mitsuya continued listening to their conversation. Mitsuya slumped forward onto the table, while Ryu observed that their conversations were unbearably sweet. He then asked whether Mitsuya was alright. Mitsuya quietly indicated that he was fine. Ryu commented that he certainly did not sound fine and asked whether he wanted to stop. After a brief pause, Mitsuya apologized. He explained that he understood why Ryu would be concerned about you becoming involved with a Yakuza, since you was his family, but his own situation was different. He had planted a bug on the person he liked and was now listening to that person being courted. He honestly wondered why he was doing something so pathetic. Inwardly, he called himself an idiot and realized that, apparently, he could not stop himself from doing foolish things when he fell in love. Ryu remained quiet for a moment before deciding that they needed something sweet as well. He suggested getting milkshakes, and Mitsuya agreed, provided Ryu paid for them. Later that night, at the park, you commented that the night breeze felt pleasant while he was slightly tipsy. Tsubaki agreed and remarked on how quiet the park was at night. You noted that it felt somewhat thrilling, and Tsubaki understood exactly what he meant. As they continued talking, Ryu and Mitsuya quietly hid among the bushes while the two walked past. Earlier, Ryu and Mitsuya had been discussing their strategy when you and Tsubaki suddenly appeared. Mitsuya whispered that they were standing far too close together, and Ryu quietly reminded him that they needed to move carefully. Unfortunately, as they began backing away, Ryu accidentally snapped a branch, startling both you and Tsubaki. Tsubaki remarked that it had sounded like someone stepped on something and wondered if anyone was there. Both Ryu and Mitsuya inwardly cursed. Gritting his teeth, Mitsuya quickly raised his voice into a high-pitched imitation of a giggling girl, implying that someone might come by. Hearing that, you commented that there certainly seemed to be a lot of excitement in the air that night. Tsubaki agreed and suggested that they leave. Once the two walked away, Mitsuya sighed in relief, thinking that they had somehow believed the act. Meanwhile, Ryu's shoulders shook with laughter as he marveled that he had never known Mitsuya could make a voice like that. Mitsuya immediately wished he would stop laughing. A few minutes later, you and Tsubaki sat together on a bench elsewhere in the park. You remarked that it had been about half a year since Tsubaki first started visiting the shop. Tsubaki observed that time had passed quickly. You admitted that he had never expected to be asked out like this. Tsubaki explained that on the day they met, he had been returning from work after finishing a long series of business meetings. Before going back to the office, he had wanted to stop somewhere, and that place had turned out to be Yu's flower shop. He admitted that flowers had once been nothing more than something he saw his men arranging. That was all they had ever meant to him. However, through Yu, he had developed a genuine interest in flowers. Yu remained confused by what he meant. Tsubaki then stood and moved in front of Yu. He admitted that everything was coming out more awkwardly than he had hoped and that he had wanted to say it somewhere better. Nevertheless, he knelt before Yu and confessed that he had fallen in love with him at first sight. He admitted that he loved Yu and asked him to go out with him. Hidden among the bushes, Mitsuya remained completely silent as Yu softly spoke Tsubaki's name. Inwardly, he reflected that the person he loved was being confessed to only a few feet away. Realizing that he had willingly chosen to listen to it, he concluded that he must be a complete masochist. Tsubaki quietly waited for Yu's answer. After a brief pause, Yu apologized and explained that he was genuinely flattered by Tsubaki's feelings. As his words trailed off, Tsubaki asked whether there was someone else he liked. Yu lowered his gaze and considered the question. There was no one he liked. Instead, there was someone he wanted to look after. That person had once helped him, and now Yu wanted to help them in return. Because of that, he could not give Tsubaki an answer. He apologized once again. Hidden nearby, Mitsuya's eyes widened, but he remained silent. Inwardly, he wondered whether Yu had turned Tsubaki down because of him. Later that night, as Yu walked home, he wondered whether Mitsuya had heard him properly. Looking down at the bug attached to his collar, he quietly reassured himself that Mitsuya did not need to worry. Meanwhile, Mitsuya stood in front of the flower shop. When Yu arrived, he looked at him in confusion. Mitsuya paused for a moment before welcoming him home. Yu smiled and returned the greeting. As they lingered outside the shop, Mitsuya asked whether Yu had enjoyed dinner. Yu answered that he had and that the food was delicious. He then mentioned that he had bought ice cream on the way home and offered one to Mitsuya. They were limited edition chocolate chip puff. Mitsuya accepted one, and as they ate together, Yu remarked that he had been surprised by a menu without any prices listed. Mitsuya found that rude, thinking that the prices should be shown. Yu laughed, noting that some restaurants were simply like that. Mitsuya commented that places like that were a hassle, while Yu chuckled and admitted that expensive restaurants still made him nervous. A brief silence settled between them. Beneath the bright moonlight, Yu remarked on how beautiful the moon was that night. Mitsuya quietly agreed that he felt the same. Yu then suggested visiting his favorite Chinese restaurant next time, mentioning that the roasted pork with spring onions and beer made the perfect combination. Mitsuya blushed before eagerly agreeing that they should definitely go. Chapter 7 began inside a cafe. As a person prepared matcha, Yu and Mitsuya remained seated despite their discomfort, quietly watching Yuriko finish the preparation. Once it was ready, Yuriko invited them to enjoy it. Mitsuya watched Yu pick up the matcha and noticed how incredibly green it was. As Yu gently twirled the matcha twice, Mitsuya observed the motion as well and wondered whether it was possible to make noise while drinking it. As the minutes passed, he inwardly groaned, finding the atmosphere unbearably suffocating. Yuriko apologized for suddenly inviting them without warning, explaining that she had wanted them to join her because she had received some nice tea cake. Yu smiled, expressing that it was a pleasure. He had been genuinely excited when Yuriko invited him, knowing he would get to enjoy delicious tea cake. Yuriko smiled and remarked that they should do this more often, prompting Yu to happily clap his hands in agreement. She then turned to Mitsuya and invited him to come again. Mitsuya casually agreed, but Yuriko corrected him, reminding him that he should answer properly. Mitsuya apologized, and Yuriko simply giggled, assuring him that it was fine since he was still young. Meanwhile, Mitsuya could only think that, more than anything else, he had gone completely numb from sitting like that. He seriously did not have the patience for it and wondered how both Yu and Yuriko looked perfectly comfortable. Later, as Yu and Mitsuya were leaving, Yu apologized for the trouble Yuriko had gone through, especially for giving them souvenirs as well. Yuriko assured him that it was fine and invited him to come for tea again, which Yu readily accepted. While they spoke, Yu's gaze drifted toward his flower arrangements, and he thanked Yuriko for displaying them. Yuriko commented that she loved the dignified appearance of the flowers Yu arranged. Mitsuya peeked at the arrangements and realized they had been made by Yu. Yu responded with a shy laugh. Yuriko confirmed that he had arranged them himself and wondered why Mitsuya had not known. Mitsuya could only apologize. Yuriko explained that, besides selling flowers, Yu also took on work such as flower arrangements and flower stands for store openings. Thanks to the flowers he prepared for her, the entrance was always gorgeous. She also wondered whether Yu had taken flower arrangement lessons somewhere. Yu explained that a friend had taught him once, and afterward he had continued learning by himself through reference videos. Mitsuya reacted with curiosity, prompting Yu to ask whether he wanted to try flower arranging as well. Mitsuya was visibly shocked, but Yu explained that it would help him develop a better sense of balance when making bouquets, deepen his understanding of flowers, and make his work more enjoyable. Yuriko agreed that it sounded like a good idea and added that, if Mitsuya improved, she would like him to arrange flowers for her too. Mitsuya swallowed nervously as he looked back at Yuriko's flowers. Later, as they walked home, Mitsuya wondered whether Yu's legs still went numb when sitting in the traditional Japanese Seiza position. Yu explained that it had taken a while to get used to, but he no longer had any problems with it. Mitsuya remarked that he had known it would be difficult for him to sit that way. Yu stared at him, prompting Mitsuya to wonder what was wrong. Yu pointed out that Mitsuya had a hunched back. Mitsuya acknowledged it, prompting Yu to suggest trying to straighten his posture. He quickly placed a hand on Mitsuya's back and adjusted his stance before instructing him to turn his shoulders outward and focus on his lower abdomen. Mitsuya followed the instructions, but by the time Yu finished, he could feel his heart beginning to race. Yu smiled, remarking that he looked like a handsome man. Mitsuya found himself thinking about how cute Yu was, though he admitted that the posture felt a little embarrassing. Yu explained that better posture would make him look even cooler and that people would see him differently. With that, Yu continued walking ahead. Mitsuya watched his back, thinking that Yu really had a way with words. There had been many moments like this lately. He suddenly paused as a realization struck him. Yu had said that he wanted to look after him. Mitsuya wondered if that meant Yu was trying to educate him, which in turn meant he was being treated like a child. He pouted and squatted down, realizing that, at this rate, he was seriously screwed. Yu immediately became concerned, wondering if something was wrong and asking whether his stomach hurt. Mitsuya quietly dismissed it as nothing. Later, back at the store, Yu explained that, honestly, regardless of the school of thought, Japanese flower arrangement or ikebana was ultimately about inspiration. Mitsuya remained confused, so Yu elaborated that it was essentially about choosing any flower, grass, or small prop that appealed to him and placing them together in a pot. As an example, Yu picked up a picture and explained that he liked small and cozy things before asking what Mitsuya liked. Mitsuya looked through the pictures until he stopped at a flashy arrangement, deciding that it was probably the one he liked. Yu remarked that it was exactly what he had expected from Mitsuya. After giving a small nod, Yu suggested that, if Mitsuya did not mind using old leftover flowers, he could practice with them. Mitsuya questioned whether that was really acceptable since the flowers were meant to be sold. Yu explained that he usually used them for practice anyway, though many of them still ended up being thrown away. Picking up a flower and holding it out to Mitsuya, he added that he would be happy if Mitsuya used them as well. Mitsuya accepted the flower and enthusiastically resolved to make the best use of them. Yu encouragingly remarked that, if Mitsuya improved, it would make his job easier. Mitsuya responded by apologizing for not being more capable at work. A few minutes later, after preparing the necessary materials, Yu explained that, since it was Mitsuya's first time, he could arrange the flowers however he liked. He then suggested choosing a theme. Mitsuya remained puzzled by the idea of a theme, and Yu confirmed that it was worth considering. Mitsuya thought for a moment before deciding that he wanted to be inspired. In truth, he mostly wanted an excuse to use the word inspired. He then wondered where he should begin. Yu explained that this was only his personal opinion, but because they were in a nightlife district, elegant flowers tended to sell better. He added that ikebana was often described as the beauty of subtraction, creating a quiet space with a definitive presence and no hesitation. It was like a stage for flowers, placing the spotlight on each individual flower rather than the group. Since Mitsuya had already learned how to arrange bouquets, it was time to take the next step. Mitsuya admitted that hearing something like that only left him completely lost. You did not think so? Mitsuya pointed out that he had never considered adding or subtracting flowers before, as he simply bundled together whatever flowers customers requested. Even so, he wanted to improve, so he hoped you would teach him. You paused for a moment before gently patting Mitsuya's head. Smiling, he thought that Mitsuya was honestly such an honest person and a rather strange guy. You found himself unable to stop keeping an eye on Mitsuya. As he continued patting Mitsuya's head, Mitsuya could only think that Yu was treating him like a child. He wondered if he was starting to resemble the youngest of the Shiruzu siblings. At this point, he concluded that Yu's eldest child instincts were completely taking over. That was not good. Moving on, Yu walked over to some tools and explained that, to begin with, they should choose a flower to serve as the lead. Before he could continue, however, Mitsuya called out to him. Yu turned to face him, and Mitsuya explained that he did not mind being treated like family, but he wanted to be useful to Yu as a person. He hoped his expression conveyed that he was not a little brother. After all, he believed he could never become anything more if Yu continued seeing him that way. Yu admitted that Mitsuya had surprised him because he was more serious than usual. Mitsuya grumbled, insisting that he was always serious. Yu laughed, agreed, and admitted that it had been his mistake. Smiling warmly, he thanked Mitsuya for telling him and explained that it was simply a bad habit of his. He tended to treat younger people like younger siblings. Mitsuya inwardly noted how unfair Yu was for being fully aware of it. You then handed Mitsuya a beer, explaining that it was simply the nature of being the eldest child, though he would be more careful from now on. Mitsuya accepted the beer, and they clinked their glasses together. As they drank, Mitsuya wondered why you kept his beer chilled among the flowers. You explained that it was very cold there, and that he could not be bothered using the refrigerator at home. After a brief pause, you admitted that it was a little late to ask but wondered whether Mitsuya wanted to drink with him. Mitsuya remarked that it really was a little late for that. A little while later, they continued drinking together. You had become slightly tipsy while Mitsuya continued working on his flower arrangement. As you let out a contented sigh, Mitsuya noticed that he seemed to be in a particularly good mood. You explained that beer after work really was the best. Mitsuya then mentioned that he had finished the arrangement while they had been talking. You reacted with surprise and moved over to examine it. Looking over Mitsuya's work, he admitted that he had expected to offer some criticism, but everything had come together perfectly. Mitsuya questioned whether that was really true. You explained that he had expected something much more intense and wondered what Mitsuya had been thinking about while arranging it. Mitsuya turned away. You waited patiently for an answer as Mitsuya stumbled over his words. Wondering whether it was something Mitsuya could not talk about, you waited for his response. Mitsuya asked whether you was sure he wanted to hear it. You admitted that he was curious. Even if it was only practice, it was still Mitsuya's first creation. Mitsuya finally revealed that he had been thinking about someone he cared about and had arranged the flowers with that person in mind. That person had been constantly on his mind. Although a little careless, the person was dignified and strong. Above all else, that person was very beautiful. As you remained silent, Mitsuya decided that the only way forward was to confess. Resolving himself, he leaned closer toward you. Just as he was about to continue, you suddenly covered Mitsuya's mouth with his hand and pressed him against the wall. Slowly pulling his hand away, you apologized in a quiet voice and stopped him there, deciding that anything beyond that point was a timeout. Chapter 8 began immediately after you covered Mitsuya's mouth with his hand. You slowly removed it, then stepped back before quickly apologizing and asking whether Mitsuya was hurt. Mitsuya answered that he was not. Moments later, he suddenly became excited, causing you to jolt and look at him in confusion. Mitsuya explained that he had been surprised when you used that move on him. Wondering if that had been the technique you mentioned teaching him the other day, he realized it had been a surprise attack that had completely caught him off guard. You started to reach toward Mitsuya but stopped himself. Noticing the hesitation, Mitsuya awkwardly continued, saying that the next time you taught him something, he wanted to be warned beforehand. You lowered his gaze, apologized once more and silently walked away. Later, inside a convenience store, Ryo browsed the shelves while inwardly groaning about having worked too many late-night shifts in a row. Suddenly, Mitsuya appeared beside him and placed an onigiri into his shopping basket. Ryo reacted in shock before wondering why Mitsuya was putting groceries into his basket. More importantly, he questioned when Mitsuya had even appeared, finding it unsettling. A short while later, after Ryo finished checking out and the cashier thanked them for their purchase, Mitsuya quietly followed him outside. Once they were outside, Ryo told Mitsuya to stop ignoring him. Mitsuya explained that he wanted to talk for a bit, and Ryo suggested finding somewhere to sit. A few minutes later, they were seated inside a restaurant. Mitsuya wondered why they had not gone to Ryo's place instead. Ryo casually explained that he lived in a dorm, so he could not simply bring people over whenever he wanted. Mitsuya remarked that he had assumed Ryo could bring back as many girls as he wanted. Ryo ignored the comment and instead asked whether Mitsuya wanted anything to eat since he wanted fries. As a result, Mitsuya became convinced that Ryo definitely brought girls back home. A few minutes later, after their food had been served, Ryo asked whether something had happened with Big Brother Yu again. Caught off guard by the sudden question, Mitsuya spat out his drink and insisted that he had not said anything, so Ryo should not assume it was about you. Ryo pointed out that most of Mitsuya's problems involved Big Brother Yu anyway and wondered whether another rival had appeared. Mitsuya thought for a moment before quietly admitting that he had tried to confess. Ryo reacted with curiosity, prompting Mitsuya to explain that you had stopped him. Ryo wondered how he had done it, and Mitsuya explained that you had used a move on him before he could say anything. Ryo reacted in surprise, finding it genuinely terrible that you would use a technique to stop someone from confessing. Mitsuya sighed and rested his head against the table. After a moment, he admitted that it had been his own fault for trying to say something like that so suddenly, but it had been obvious that you did not want to hear it. After that, he had started fooling around and guessed that he had gotten a little carried away. Ryo frowned as he watched Mitsuya slowly slide down the table, quietly sobbing while thinking that it figured he would end up wondering whether you hated him. Taking a sip of his drink, Ryo explained that he did not know whether it would be comforting, but he did not think you disliked Mitsuya at all. Hearing that, Mitsuya's eyes snapped open. He immediately sat upright and wondered how Ryo could be so certain. Ryo leaned away, questioning why Mitsuya had suddenly moved so close and finding it unsettling. He then explained that, simply put, you was not used to being liked. Friendships and professional relationships were fine, but nothing beyond that. Whenever someone confessed to him, you would reject them immediately because he could not handle the emotional burden. Even if the feelings came from someone he liked as well, he would still avoid confronting them. It seemed that you was struggling with something within himself. Mitsuya leaned in even closer, wondering whether you had always been like that. Ryu confirmed that he had, while muttering that Mitsuya was still too close. Mitsuya quietly accepted the explanation. Ryu added that this was why he had warned Mitsuya it would be difficult, having watched countless people be crushed by his brother Yu's ironclad heart. He then decided to order something sweet and asked whether Mitsuya wanted anything as well. A little later, after 2 desserts were brought to the table, Ryu continued explaining that people who fell in love with his brother Yu strangely tended to idolize him. Because he was always surrounded by flowers, people often formed an idealized image of him, when in reality he was simply a nice guy who liked fried food and alcohol. Mitsuya remarked that Yu was not old enough to be called an old man. Ryu pointed out that Yu himself had referred to himself that way not long ago. He advised Mitsuya that it would be easier if he thought of Yu in that way instead. It was better to see him as an ordinary person than as some mysterious figure. Yu was simply a 29-year-old man. Later, after they finished eating and left the restaurant, Ryu remarked that he was completely full and waved goodbye to Mitsuya. Mitsuya stopped him, prompting Ryu to wonder if there was anything else. After a brief pause, Mitsuya simply thanked him. Although surprised, Ryu replied that it was no problem. After all, they were friends. As he walked away, he told Mitsuya that he would see him later. Mitsuya acknowledged him and watched him leave. Meanwhile, as Ryu walked home, he noticed Mitsuya's onigiri still sitting in his bag. Realizing he had forgotten to return it, he brushed it off as only an onigiri. As he lit a cigarette, he thought back to the sudden invitation to the bathhouse, Mitsuya's insistence on spending time together, and the anxiety he had shown over the growing distance between himself and Yu. Ryu wondered why Mitsuya did not simply show Yu those feelings. Later that night, after returning home and lying on his bed, Mitsuya resolved that he had to tell Yu the following day. At the same time, Yu sat upright on his own bed as his heart began beating a little too fast. The next day, while preparing breakfast, Yu discussed arranging a few things with someone. Off to the side, Mitsuya appeared and greeted him with a good morning. Yu returned the greeting, mentioned that he had grilled some fish, and wondered whether Mitsuya preferred mackerel or salmon. Mitsuya thought for a moment, but instead of answering, he stepped closer to Yu. Yu immediately took a step back and gripped the sink, looking at him in confusion. Mitsuya shyly admitted that he did not really know how to put it, but he did not want to cause Yu any trouble. With that, he bowed and enthusiastically expressed his hope that Yu would continue taking care of him that day as well. Yu reacted in surprise before agreeing that he supposed he would, adding that he would do his best too. Inwardly, Mitsuya resolved that he could not keep running away. He wanted to stay with Yu, and if that meant taking a few detours, then he was willing to accept them. As they began setting the table for breakfast, Yu remarked that Mitsuya's enthusiasm had surprised him. Mitsuya admitted that he was feeling a little desperate. Once they started eating, Yu remembered something and asked whether Mitsuya could make a delivery for him afterward. It was for a florist he knew who seemed to be having trouble with their flowers. Mitsuya readily agreed and asked whether he could go after finishing breakfast. Yu thanked him, mentioning that there was a very specific delivery time before explaining the location as well. Later, when Mitsuya arrived, he stopped at the entrance of Club Dandelion. Looking up at the building, he questioned whether this was really the place. After heading inside and announcing that he was delivering flowers, he told himself that he needed to finish as quickly as possible and leave. A staff member instructed him to place the flowers on a nearby table. Mitsuya quickly assembled the arrangement and immediately tried to slip away. Before he could leave, however, a woman suddenly called out to him and waved enthusiastically. She happily remarked that it had been such a long time and admitted that she had honestly thought he was dead since she had not seen him around lately. Startled, Mitsuya recognized the woman as Aoi and wondered what she was doing there. Aoi explained that she worked as a cabaret hostess, adding that it should have been obvious just from looking at her. She remarked that it really had been a long time and guessed that it had already been about 2 years. Mitsuya continued edging away, inwardly thinking that once Aoi caught hold of someone, she never stopped talking. Aoi noticed that he was working as a florist now, and Mitsuya confirmed it. Surprised, she wrapped herself around his arm and pointed out that, since he was free at the moment, they should go have a drink together. Mitsuya immediately refused, explaining that he had driven there for the delivery. Besides, there was already alcohol back at the shop, so he needed to return. He told her to let go. Mitsuya tried to pull away, but Aoi complained that it had been so long and insisted that they should have a drink together. Mitsuya told her to stop and suggested another time instead. Aoi then casually mentioned that Kikushima was there at that very moment. Mitsuya's heart skipped a beat. At that exact moment, a man appeared behind both of them. He remarked in surprise that things had seemed unusually noisy before recognizing Mitsuya. Looking him over, The man wondered what Mitsuya was doing dressed like that. Mitsuya turned toward him and addressed him as Aniki. Chapter 9 began inside the flower shop. Mitsuya informed you that he had put away the flowers outside. You thanked him and remarked that they should close up. Mitsuya then asked whether he could leave for a while at noon the following day. You reacted with surprise before agreeing that it would be fine, explaining that he saw no reason to refuse, though it was unusual. He wondered whether Mitsuya was going out to have fun. Looking away, Mitsuya shyly admitted that it was something like that. You noticed his reaction but simply commented that they had stocked up that day and that he planned to open the shop at a leisurely pace. Mitsuya bowed in thanks before quickly turning away, saying that he was going to take out the trash. As you watched him leave, he wondered why Mitsuya seemed so distant. Reaching into his pocket and pulling out 2 tickets, you decided that he could ask Mitsuya out another day. The following day at noon, orders and instructions echoed throughout a restaurant as Mitsuya hurried from one table to another, thinking that everything was unbelievably hectic. The reason for it all traced back to the previous day, when he had run into Kikushima again. At that time, Kikushima had explained that they were shorthanded for the daytime cabaret shift the next day and informed Mitsuya that he would be coming in to help. Mitsuya had reacted in shock, pointing out that he still had to work at night. Kikushima had brushed it off, explaining that they had enough staff for the night shift. He then slid an advance payment across to Mitsuya. Although Mitsuya had tried to refuse, he failed to stop him. Kikushima told him that he was counting on him before quietly adding that he needed him. After waving goodbye and saying that he would see Mitsuya the following day, Kikushima walked away. Mitsuya had remained frozen, realizing that it felt like forced labor. Back in the present, Kikushima sat comfortably in one of the booths while wondering whether Mitsuya was working hard. As Mitsuya wiped down his table, he shouted that he had been incredibly busy. Kikushima replied that it was exactly why he had called him in. He remarked that Mitsuya was not working anywhere particularly large at the moment and suggested that he become a regular employee there instead. If he worked hard, he could even become a manager. Mitsuya paused at those words before silently walking away. Kikushima tried calling after him, but as Mitsuya continued leaving, Aoi commented that he seemed a little cold. Kikushima observed that Mitsuya was only sulking because he had been left alone. Aoi questioned what was so cute about him. Hearing that, Mitsuya cursed inwardly, and his expression hardened. Remembering how Kikushima had taken him in when he was a child, he also remembered how Kikushima had let him get his hopes up only to abandon him once he became inconvenient. Wondering what time it was, Mitsuya recalled being told he could go home once everything was finished, though he questioned whether it would ever actually end. As he returned to the lobby, he wondered what all the commotion was about. Meanwhile, Kikushima continued enjoying himself until a staff member approached and excused himself. Kikushima asked what was wrong, and the staff explained that a customer was complaining about the bill. Groaning, Kikushima headed toward the lobby. As soon as he arrived, he heard Mitsuya shouting at someone not to run away. The customer yelled back that Mitsuya was only a regular employee and questioned whether it was acceptable to treat customers that way. Mitsuya responded by kicking the customer in the head before shouting at him to shut up, insisting that the customer had started it first. Watching Mitsuya scream while beating up the customers, Kikushima remarked that the suicide squad was out and that everyone had barely survived. Kikushima let out a whistle, thinking that Mitsuya was still quick to pick a fight. Mitsuya swiftly dodged one of the customer's punches and slammed him to the ground, remarking that he was slower than Yukimasa. Once all the customers had been beaten, Kikushima quietly took note of the name Yukimasa. As Mitsuya muttered that those guys had given him a hard time, his eyes suddenly widened when Kikushima called out to him. Startled, Mitsuya turned toward him while Kikushima calmly suggested that they talk for a while. Mitsuya lowered his head and quietly agreed. A few minutes later, Mitsuya waited in silence as Kikushima smoked a cigarette. Inwardly, he panicked, convinced that Kikushima was definitely going to kill him. He could already imagine him calling in dangerous people because of what had happened. He doubted he would even make it home that day. Instead, Kikushima suddenly burst into loud laughter. After a moment, Mitsuya looked at him in confusion. Kikushima remarked that, just as he had expected, Mitsuya had not changed one bit. Mitsuya immediately apologized for causing trouble with a customer. Kikushima brushed it aside, explaining that the customer had been a nuisance for a long time and that even the hostesses and the other customers disliked him. He decided to use the incident as an opportunity to ban the customer from the establishment. Kikushima stood up, and just as Mitsuya was about to speak, he reached over and patted Mitsuya on the head, thanking him for protecting the store. Mitsuya froze. The gesture reminded him of how Kikushima used to comfort him when he was younger, patting his head the same way whenever he was feeling down, like comforting a depressed dog. He had always been weak against that. Kikushima then wondered what kind of miserable place Mitsuya had gotten himself into. Mitsuya replied that it was not a miserable place but a flower shop. Surprised, Kikushima questioned how refined Mitsuya had become before suddenly bursting into laughter, and telling him to give him a break. Mitsuya blushed, insisting that it was not that funny. Kikushima continued laughing until his stomach hurt while Mitsuya silently waited for him to finish. Once he had calmed down, Kikushima suggested that Mitsuya quit his job and come work for him instead. Mitsuya froze in confusion, prompting Kikushima to explain that he had always known Mitsuya belonged on their side, and they were short-handed as well. He assumed Mitsuya did not truly want to cause trouble for a place like the flower shop. Kikushima admitted that it had been his own fault for leaving Mitsuya behind back then and said that he regretted it. If Mitsuya wanted compensation, they would prepare it for him. All he had to do was come back. Mitsuya barely registered the rest of Kikushima's words. Instead, he could only think that it could not be true that a flower shop was something to look down on. He remembered how you had comforted him. Letting out a quiet sigh, Mitsuya slowly explained that he would never forget what Kikushima had done for him. Kikushima remarked that Mitsuya had become quite the talker and urged him to continue. Mitsuya apologized for being blunt but admitted that he still could not let go of the fact that Kikushima had abandoned him. As an ex-convict, he had no one to turn to for help. Kikushima had taken him in and saved him. Mitsuya then recalled that it had been his birthday the other day. Even though you had barely known him, he had celebrated it together with him. Mitsuya had been so happy that it frightened him, even though it had only been his birthday. He had not yet repaid that kindness. That was why he wanted to live for you. Before Mitsuya could finish, Kikushima kicked over a trash can. He slowly stepped closer and remarked that Mitsuya was still a spoiled child. Muttering that Mitsuya now owed the man at the flower shop simply because he had celebrated his birthday, Kikushima questioned whether Mitsuya had spent so much time smelling flowers that his head had turned into a flower garden. He had only just offered to take Mitsuya back, yet Mitsuya was trampling on his feelings. Mitsuya remained frozen, repeatedly telling himself not to be afraid. Kikushima continued by saying that, if Mitsuya thought he was such a great flower seller, then he should go up against another flower seller. Kikushima stepped behind Mitsuya and lightly touched his throat, wondering whether he had nothing to say. Mitsuya thought about how he had come there because he had been told to. He had been unable to overcome his sense of indebtedness, his fear, or any of those lingering feelings. Even so, he wanted to go his own way. Gathering his resolve, Mitsuya told Kikushima that he intended to live his life without relying on his help. Kikushima frowned before patting Mitsuya on the shoulder. He remarked that Mitsuya was a good person and that he would wait for him because he believed Mitsuya would return eventually. Declaring that it was time to leave, Kikushima turned and walked away. Mitsuya remained motionless until he was certain he had gone. The next moment, his legs gave out and he collapsed to the ground, letting out a long breath as he realized how terrifying the encounter had been. Looking at his trembling hand, Mitsuya reflected on how astonishing the difference was between Kikushima's gentle side and his frightening side. Turning his head, Mitsuya noticed the flowers he had delivered the previous day. Inwardly, he admitted that Aniki had been right. He was crude, quick-witted, and violent. Even so, he had found a place where he truly belonged. Mitsuya wanted to live somewhere different. He had no intention of ever returning to Kikushima. As he cleaned up the area, Mitsuya sighed to himself, noting that the trash was scattered everywhere. Picking up one of the flowers, he observed that it was still blooming beautifully and decided it would be a waste to leave it behind, so he would take it home instead. He then stepped back inside the club after remembering that he had forgotten to collect his paycheck, only to realize that it was actually the consolation money. Later, as Mitsuya left the club, he decided that it was time to head home. Upon arriving, he let out a sigh when he saw that you had already arranged the flowers outside. Mitsuya resolved to apologize to you immediately. Before he could enter the shop, however, he noticed a customer and stopped in place as he watched Tsubaki embrace you. Mitsuya's smile disappeared, and he stared in confusion. Chapter 10 continued immediately after Mitsuya saw you and Tsubaki embrace. Mitsuya quickly hid around the corner, realizing that the man was the young head of the Seisaku group who had once confessed to you and been rejected. He wondered why Tsubaki was there. Although he knew Tsubaki had been a regular customer, he still could not understand why he was hugging you. Panic began to set in as Mitsuya wondered whether things had been progressing without him. He also found himself wondering how long you intended to keep hugging Tsubaki. Tsubaki happened to glance up and noticed Mitsuya, but Mitsuya immediately ducked back behind the corner, questioning whether their eyes had just met. Inside the shop, Tsubaki realized that Mitsuya worked there. You called his attention, pulling him from his thoughts. Tsubaki excused himself and thanked you once again for doing him one last favor. You smiled, saying it was no trouble, though he admitted he was sorry to hear that Tsubaki was moving away. He wondered whether Tsubaki planned to return anytime soon. After thinking for a moment, Tsubaki explained that he was working toward it, but that it would take some time. You commented that it was still sad to lose a regular customer and hoped he would visit again once he returned. Tsubaki agreed that he would. Before leaving, he quietly asked you to keep what had happened that day between the two of them. As Tsubaki got into his car and drove away, He reflected that the employee he had seen earlier must have been the person you wanted to keep an eye on. Although he knew it was childish, he decided that a small prank would be harmless. Letting out a sigh, Tsubaki thought about how he had never wanted to transfer. A few minutes later, you stood deep in thought until the shop door creaked open and Mitsuya returned. Mitsuya announced that he was back. You smiled and welcomed him home before remarking that he was late. Mitsuya apologized, explaining that the delivery had taken quite a while. Turning away, you assured him that it was fine because there had not been any customers and he had simply been relaxing. Mitsuya immediately realized that you had lied, but he said nothing. Instead, he remarked that he would make up for the delay and went to change into his work clothes. You smiled and told him to take his time. As Mitsuya walked away, he failed to notice a piece of paper lying on the floor. Wondering what it was, you reached down to pick it up, thinking it might have fallen from Mitsuya's pocket. His hand stopped as he read the business card and realized it belonged to the general manager, Kikushima Cookie. You quietly let out a sigh. Later that night, you remained absent-minded inside the shop until Mitsuya called out to him. When you finally responded, Mitsuya observed that he seemed unusually distracted that day and wondered whether he was all right. You admitted that he was probably just a little tired. Before long, the day had passed, and it was already time to close the shop. Mitsuya watched you walk away, convinced that something was wrong. As expected, he suspected it had something to do with Tsubaki's visit earlier. Unable to let it go, Mitsuya called out to you once more. When you asked what was wrong, Mitsuya mentioned that a customer had visited shortly before he returned. You looked confused and insisted that no one had come. Realizing that you had deliberately avoided the subject, Mitsuya reached out and tugged on Yu's apron. As you turned toward him, Mitsuya admitted that he had seen everything and specifically mentioned the regular customer with glasses. He wondered why you had hidden it from him. You fell silent for a moment before deciding that there was something he wanted to ask as well. He took out the business card he had found earlier and handed it to Mitsuya. Mitsuya reacted in surprise as you explained that it had fallen out of Mitsuya's pocket and that it belonged to a place where Mitsuya had supposedly already resigned. While Mitsuya tried to remember when the card could have appeared, you quietly asked what he had been doing at noon. Before Mitsuya could explain himself, a customer entered the shop and greeted them with a good evening. The customer chuckled, remarking that the place was small but still a proper flower shop. You immediately welcomed the customer and asked if there was anything he could help with. The customer explained that he had only come to take something home. After looking around the shop, his gaze settled on Mitsuya. Mitsuya's eyes widened as he suddenly felt himself being pulled backward. In the next moment, Kikushima asked you if he could have Mitsuya. Startled, Mitsuya demanded to know why Kikushima was there. Kikushima explained that Mitsuya had forgotten to collect his salary, so he had brought it to him personally. Looking away, Mitsuya angrily insisted that he did not need it and could not accept it. Kikushima dismissed his refusal, telling him not to be so stubborn. He admitted that he still wanted Mitsuya back and wondered why Mitsuya would not grant his lifelong request. Kikushima's attention then shifted toward you, and he asked whether he was the shop manager. You confirmed that he was, but before he could continue, Kikushima reacted with exaggerated surprise, commenting on how beautiful the manager was. He remarked that Mitsuya worked alongside someone so beautiful that it was no wonder he had never mentioned it before, calling him cold for keeping it a secret. You responded with a polite smile while Kikushima observed that you must have been Mitsuya's benefactor. Teasingly, he wondered whether Mitsuya's feelings had grown beyond gratitude into love. Mitsuya's face immediately turned red. Kikushima continued teasing him, saying that there was no reason to be embarrassed because anyone would fall in love with someone who had saved them. He concluded that Mitsuya simply wanted to stay beside the person he had fallen in love with after being rescued by them and remarked that Mitsuya was truly adorable. Kikushima then handed you a business card, introducing himself as Mitsuya's former employer and saying that he could be contacted for anything. He even joked that you was welcome to call him on lonely nights. As you accepted the card, his eyes widened when he realized it was the same business card he had found earlier. He remained silent while Kikushima turned back to Mitsuya and told him that it was time to go. As Mitsuya tried to stop him, you suddenly reached out and grabbed Kikushima's jacket. Both Kikushima and Mitsuya turned toward him as you calmly asked Kikushima to let Mitsuya go. Kikushima looked puzzled before remarking that, now that you mentioned it, he had not paid for Mitsuya yet. Taking Mitsuya away without paying would be no different from stealing, so he asked the beautiful manager how much he wanted. You quietly replied that he had not meant anything like that. Curious about Yu's expression, Kikushima questioned what that look was supposed to mean. You answered that Mitsuya was one of their precious employees, and that he could not simply stand by and allow someone to take him away. Growing irritated, Kikushima reminded him that he had already offered to pay. You asked whether Kikushima had honestly expected him to accept. Stepping closer, you stated that Kikushima was the one who had abandoned Mitsuya, so there was no way he could entrust Mitsuya to someone like him. He then took hold of Mitsuya's arm, pulled him away from Kikushima, and declared that he would not hand Mitsuya over. Kikushima let out a sigh, remarking that it was a cute thing to say and that he liked it. He then suggested that, since there was already someone as beautiful as the manager in the shop, the two of them should work together there, with Mitsuya remaining behind the scenes. Smirking, Kikushima added that he would bring them plenty of good customers. Yu frowned and cut him off, putting an end to the insults. Kikushima then reached toward Yu's hair. In the next instant, Mitsuya pulled Yu away from Kikushima and slapped Kikushima's hand aside. Yu froze while Kikushima reacted to the blow. Mitsuya declared that enough was enough and that he wanted nothing more to do with Kikushima. He realized that, although Kikushima had come for him, he had always been nothing more than another pawn. Everything was simply too convenient for Kikushima, and he had even mocked the manager. Inwardly, Mitsuya berated himself for being so careless despite having resolved to protect Yu. Kikushima told him not to glare at him like that. Groaning, he remarked that Mitsuya was still quick with his hands, just as he had been when dealing with the thugs earlier. He observed that Mitsuya was obviously not a florist and wondered whether the manager thought the same. Yu reacted angrily, but Mitsuya quickly stepped in front of him, bowed and politely asked Kikushima to leave. Instead, Kikushima grabbed a watering can and poured its contents over Mitsuya. Mitsuya's eyes widened as water drenched him. Kikushima let out a disappointed sigh, commenting that the whole situation had become boring. Yu immediately hurried to Mitsuya's side in concern. Kikushima remarked that bowing so readily had only left even Mitsuya's brand-new shoes soaked. Mitsuya could only think that everything had happened because of him. Meanwhile, Kikushima took out his phone and called someone, instructing them to bring the car around because he was taking 2 people with him. He specified that they should come to the shop on the corner. A moment later, he questioned why the other person claimed the car could not get through. As Kikushima opened the door to leave, Yukimasa appeared, displayed an identification card, and greeted him. Yukimasa explained that they had received a report about some kind of disturbance at the shop. Walking over to Yu, Yukimasa asked whether he was all right. Yu smiled and assured him that he was, thanking him for coming. Yukimasa remarked that they could hardly keep the community safe if they failed to protect the shop run by the eldest son of their police family. Hearing the words, eldest son, and police family, Kikushima smirked and remarked that it made things troublesome. He opened the door again, only for Ryu to appear and ask him to wait because they were not finished with him yet. Kikushima glared at Yukimasa, who calmly placed a hand on his shoulder and suggested that they have a proper discussion with the troublesome man. Later, Ryu and Mitsuya stood quietly outside the shop while Ryu wrote down Mitsuya's statement. Ryu offered him a cigarette, but Mitsuya declined. Mitsuya admitted that he had not expected Ryu to smoke. Ryu wondered whether it made him look cool, but Mitsuya concluded that it really did not. Shifting his stance, Mitsuya asked how they had managed to arrive so quickly. Before Ryu could answer, Yu explained that he had sent an emergency message to a group chat with his siblings. He admitted that he had only tried it without knowing whether it would actually work. Ryu added that Yukimasa had been eating dinner nearby and that he himself was almost always at the police station. Yu observed that they had been lucky. Ryu further explained that neither Mitsuya nor Yu had laid a hand on the other party. Even if they had, it would have qualified as self-defense, while the other side had committed obstruction of business. Mitsuya quietly understood. Ryu acknowledged that Mitsuya was probably exhausted but asked him to endure a little longer, remarking that he seemed to have gotten caught up in one incident after another. Hearing those words, Mitsuya's eyes widened. A few minutes later, Ryu climbed back onto his bicycle and informed Yu and Mitsuya that there would likely be increased patrols around the area for the time being, just to be safe. He told them to contact him if they needed anything before saying goodbye. Mitsuya and Yu watched him ride away. After a short silence, Yu suggested that they head back inside. Instead, Mitsuya apologized for all the trouble he had caused. Yu placed a hand on Mitsuya's back and admitted that he was the one who should apologize. He had been the one who was supposed to take responsibility for his own mistakes, yet he had doubted Mitsuya. He assured Mitsuya that he had done well. As they returned to the shop, Yu admitted that Kikushima had been rather frightening. Back inside, Yu suggested that they have dinner after closing the shop. Feeling tired, he proposed ordering delivery instead. Looking through his phone, he remarked that, although it was already quite late, many restaurants were still open. He then asked Mitsuya what he wanted to eat. Mitsuya remained silent. After Yu called his name, Mitsuya finally admitted that he thought he would have to quit. Chapter 11 began with Yu preparing tea. After placing 2 cups on the table, he sat down and quietly drank his tea. A few minutes later, Mitsuya entered and thanked Yu for letting him use the bath. Yu asked if he felt refreshed, and after Mitsuya confirmed that he did, Yu offered him the tea he had prepared. Mitsuya thanked him and picked up the cup, only to immediately jerk in surprise at its heat. Yu remarked that he probably should have let it cool since Mitsuya had just come out of the bath. Mitsuya quickly insisted that it was fine and added that it was delicious. Yu laughed, pleased to hear that. He explained that it had been a gift and that he was fairly sure it was called lemon balm. Mitsuya found himself curious, thinking that the lemon balm somehow felt relaxing. As the conversation settled, you returned to what they had discussed earlier and asked if he could hear more, specifically about why Mitsuya wanted to quit. Sadness spread across Mitsuya's face as he explained everything that had happened earlier, along with the many problems that had come even before that. In his eyes, they had all been his fault. Every time, he ended up causing trouble for you, and he could not help feeling that he was only getting in Yu's way. That was why he had decided he should quit. You remained silent for a moment before asking whether Mitsuya had any plans after quitting. Mitsuya searched for an answer, but he had none. Even so, he did not want to become a burden. Sensing his hesitation, you reached toward him instead and pointed out that his hair was still wet. He retrieved a blow-dryer and decided to dry Mitsuya's hair for him. Mitsuya quietly allowed it as you began drying his hair. Stunned, Mitsuya thought that they had just been discussing what he should do next. His hair hardly seemed important, yet the warmth felt pleasant. It made him sleepy. He reflected that no one had dried his hair for him since he was a child. You responded that he used to dry his younger siblings' hair as well, though he rarely had the chance anymore. Mitsuya observed that you seemed to take good care of his own hair. You gave a quiet hum before admitting that it was not really like that. He had not cared about it at all before. He had simply left it alone after becoming busy, and it had eventually grown that long. You then noticed that he had split ends, prompting Mitsuya to apologize. Silence settled over them again as you continued drying his hair. After a while, Mitsuya admitted that he had assumed you had been growing it out because it suited him. You laughed and thanked him but confessed that he was honestly just lazy. Mitsuya then suggested that they should get their hair trimmed together sometime. A few minutes later, you switched off the blow-dryer and told Mitsuya that his hair was dry. Mitsuya reacted in surprise when he noticed how fluffy it had become. He turned toward you and thanked him sincerely, but you immediately turned his head back the other way and stopped him from looking. As you continued playing with his hair, Mitsuya became confused and wondered if something was wrong. You considered how to explain himself before returning to what they had been discussing. Mitsuya's eyes widened, and he instinctively pulled away slightly, but you caught him by the shoulder. He understood why Mitsuya would worry about the same thing happening again after so many unusual events had occurred one after another. It was confusing. Mitsuya let out a groan. He had wanted to quit, but hearing you speak as though he were firing him still hurt. However, you continued, explaining that Mitsuya was the one who allowed him to experience moments like these. When Mitsuya questioned what he meant, you explained that it was the simple things, such as drinking delicious tea, sharing ordinary events, or having quiet conversations. Mitsuya remarked that anyone would be happy to drink tea with you, but you disagreed. As he had grown older, he had come to realize that there were fewer people whose timing naturally matched his own. It was something he had never noticed when he was younger. Mitsuya fell silent for a moment before telling you that if you asked him to come, he would go to him no matter what. You lowered his gaze and admitted that he did not really know how to express himself. Mitsuya was about to respond, but you apologized and asked him to let him finish. Mitsuya's eyes widened as he realized that Yu's voice was trembling for some reason. After a brief pause, you admitted that he had been scared. Mitsuya wondered whether it was because of Aniki's threats. You acknowledged that those had honestly been frightening as well, but what had affected him the most was hearing Mitsuya say that he was going to quit. Staff members had left before, so it would not have been the first time, yet the thought of Mitsuya leaving made him feel unbearably lonely. Mitsuya had become an important part of his life, and it would be difficult for him if he were gone. Mitsuya swallowed hard as sweat ran down his face. You told him that he did not need to look at him, and that he could stay facing forward. In response, Mitsuya admitted that he liked you with all his respect and all his desire. Because of that, hearing you say such things made it difficult not to let his hopes rise. You truly was an unfair person. At the same time, Mitsuya thought that he had actually wanted to confess while looking directly at you, but he had been afraid of being rejected again. He felt that he had been unfair to himself as well, unwilling to give you the chance to run away. After several moments of silence, Mitsuya asked whether you was really going to say nothing. He wondered if you truly was not going to respond. Unable to endure the silence any longer, he turned toward you and urged him to say something. He immediately froze when he saw tears running down Yu's face. Mitsuya hurriedly stood and looked at him in confusion. Through sobs and faltering words, you explained that what he had said earlier had been his own way of confessing. He apologized for being unclear and for being unfair. Mitsuya panicked and hurriedly told him to forget everything he had just said. You blushed and admitted that it was true. This had been the only chance he had to confess, and he honestly felt pathetic because of it. Overwhelmed by the moment, Mitsuya knelt in front of you and asked if he could hug him. You pointed to himself as though confirming that Mitsuya meant him. Mitsuya explained that he had never been the one to initiate a hug before. You shyly pointed out that he still had not taken a bath. Keeping a serious expression, Mitsuya accepted that without complaint while inwardly wondering what you was even talking about. After a brief pause, Mitsuya asked whether the answer was still no and apologized for asking so suddenly. You glanced back at him, leaned forward and embraced him. Mitsuya wrapped his arms around you and held him tightly. You thought that the hug was a little too tight. Mitsuya admitted that he was not used to this sort of thing and that it felt embarrassing. You remarked that he was acting awkward despite his age because he simply could not stop feeling nervous. Mitsuya observed that you was actually quite muscular. You wondered whether that was surprising and whether it bothered him. Mitsuya answered that nothing about the person he liked could ever bother him. As they remained in each other's arms, you asked if Mitsuya would stay there with him. Mitsuya wondered if he truly could, and you replied that he had no reason to send him away. Mitsuya warned that there might still be more trouble ahead. You rested his forehead against Mitsuya's and promised that when that time came, he would protect him. Mitsuya's eyes flew open, and he suddenly apologized. You looked at him in confusion as Mitsuya slowly collapsed onto the floor. He muttered that it had startled him and wondered if Mitsuya had fallen asleep. In the quiet that followed, you retrieved a blanket and a pillow, reflecting that it had been a long day. After gently resting Mitsuya's head on the pillow, you lay down beside him and wished him a good night.